Are we ready to begin? All right. Good morning. Let me welcome you to this event, co-sponsored by the LBJ Washington Center and the Political Economy Research Institute of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. My name is James Galbraith. I am a professor at the LBJ School, the University of Texas at Austin. And because I'm here with several colleagues who go back to my days as a member of the staff on Capitol Hill, I'd add that I hold the Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair in Government Business Relations and had the privilege of working with Senator Benson on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee for 4 years in the early 1980s. This is a book event. It is an event which was organized originally around a book that it was just came out by Professor James Crotty of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a book entitled Keynes Against Capitalism, His Economic Case for Liberal Socialism. Professor Crotty is unfortunately not able to travel to be here to present his book, so it will be presented by Professor Robert Poland, close colleague and friend. I just want to say that it was a particular privilege of mine to be able to suggest that we hold this event, and I'm deeply grateful to all the institutional parties who were able to come together to sponsor it and arrange for it to be held here. I think it's a remarkable occasion and a chance to speak about some very interesting work. But there's more, a good deal more, because as we developed the idea for this symposium, it seemed to us appropriate to bring in the work of a number of other very distinguished colleagues who were able to travel and be here in person to speak about their own work. I want to, first of all, mention my dear friend, Jane DeRista, whom I've known since the early 1970s, when I joined first the staff of the Banking Committee, or perhaps before, in the summer of '74. Jane has a long career as a senior expert on banking and monetary policy, but she also has an important Texas connection insofar as she is the living representative of the spirit of a grand old man of Texas politics and of American politics, Congressman Wright Patman, whom I got to know briefly during my tenure on the Banking Committee staff. We have here also Ilene Grabel, a distinguished university professor at the University of Denver University. Ilene has a book which is on finance and development, and very much in the spirit of another person that I had the privilege of knowing as a very young man, and that is Albert Hirschman, my father's colleague, and an inspiration to anybody who thinks in a fresh and independent manner about the relationship between rich and poor countries and the world. And we have Gerald Epstein, Jerry Epstein, a friend to us all, a senior figure with the Political Economy Research Institute and the Economics Department at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and a longtime student and expert on the politics of central banking. Yet another topic with which I've had my own engagement over the years. So I can say that I couldn't be more pleased, both with the people who were willing to come to talk about their work at this symposium with the discussants, who are all very distinguished people and close friends in their own right, and with friends and colleagues who've come out this morning to hear this discussion. And so with that, let me turn it over to Professor Robert Poland. Why don't you take the floor, Bob, and take us into the first session.
Morning, and I just want to first say to thank James Galbraith for initiating this conference idea and really getting it rolling. The idea started, I believe, well, it may have formed in Jamie's head before, but we were together a year ago, almost exactly, at the one and only Sanders Institute conference in Vermont. And the Institute has since been shut down. So it may be the only one ever. But Jamie we were sitting together and he just said, I just read Jim Crotty's book. It's fantastic. We should have a conference. Well, here we are a year later. Thank you, Jamie. As Jamie said, that Jim can't make it, but in standing up here on his behalf, I was thinking about that, and I've actually flashed way back to actually my very, 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 very first day as a graduate student at the New School for Social Research, because the very first day of my first class, the class was called Reading and Using Capital, and the professor was Paul Sweezy, who at the time was the most eminent Marxist economist in the world. And of course, hundreds of us were hoarding in to take this class with Sweezy. It was electric in the room. There was like 400 people. And then we're all waiting for the great man, Sweezy, to show up. And instead, this youngish guy with a really long hair and a ponytail and sandals, even though it was January, walks in and says, "I am not Paul Sweezy." That was David Gordon. And so I am not Jim Crotty. So just in case you were confused. So I will try to give an accurate assessment of the main themes in Crotty's outstanding book. Now, Jim himself, speaking of demurrals, starts out the book by saying, the reader should be aware that, unfortunately, I am neither an economic historian nor a historian of economic thought. I would have loved to have co-authored this book with the great British economic historian Eric Hobsbawm. Unfortunately, he died in 2012, and to the best of my knowledge, he had never heard of me. Crotty did the task all on his own, developing his framework in terms of understanding the economic history of the time, the history of thought where Keynes fits in. But Crotty also brings another feature, which is a very powerful organizing force for the book, which is that Crotty is certainly among the outstanding heterodox macroeconomists of his generation. Now, I myself don't like the term heterodox. I just haven't thought of a better one. Crotty uses it. So in the way that I think of Jim Crotty as a heterodox economist, it is a creative synthesis of Marx, Keynes, Kalecki, going all the way back to actually the very first paper I read, academic paper I read as a graduate student, which is Crotty and Bodie's paper, basically on class conflict in the business cycle, which built from Kalecki. One of the features of Crotty's incredibly distinguished career as a heterodox, or whatever we want to call it, macroeconomist, is his intense focus on understanding real things about how the world really works. And certainly that also characterizes Keynes, Marx, and Kalecki. That is not the way that I would characterize what we would call orthodox economics, and it's certainly not the way that Crotty characterizes orthodox economics in general or in this book. So I want to read a passage here, which I will be doing a lot of since I am channeling Jim Crotty. So I want to channel this great book. And so here's what Crotty is saying about mainstream classical and mainstream Keynesian theory. He says, neither the classical theory nor the mainstream Keynesian theory of financial markets follows Keynes's methodology. Both offer general or very Keynes's methodology trying to understand the real world. Both offer general or very abstract theories in which financial markets are always well behaved. They offer a theory of the bond market, in which agents know the probability distributions of the future interest rates, in which interest rates always fall when aggregate demand receives a negative shock, in which, quote, what Keynes calls insane financial market gambling casinos cannot exist, and in which there is one model of interest rate determination that applies to all economies that are sufficiently capitalist. That is why classical theory was incapable of predicting or explaining the US financial market chaos of the late 1920s and early 1930s, and why modern mainstream financial market theory did not predict and cannot explain ex post the global financial crisis that began in 2007. Keynes's applied theory of financial markets was designed to explain their behavior in both relatively stable times and in periods of great market volatility. Now, the fact that Crotty is stating the obvious here, that mainstream macro of all stripes, a massive enterprise, by the way, we're talking about tens of thousands of people that do this every day as a job and get pretty well paid, totally failed to understand the buildup of the financial instability that led to the crisis, can only be said to represent abject failure, professional failure. It's amazing these people still have jobs. Now, by contrast, what's the message in Crotty's book? Crotty's book was really based on this fundamental idea about Keynes that was also completely overlooked, neglected, buried by mainstream economics, which is that John Maynard Keynes was throughout his working life a committed democratic socialist, or what Crotty and Keynes himself called a liberal socialist. Keynes's aim in all of his work, as Crotty's book emphasizes, was not to tinker with capitalism, to not smooth out some of its rough edges, not save capitalism from itself, as is often characterized of Keynes, but a committed social transformation was what John Maynard Keynes, the real John Maynard Keynes, was all about. And that's what Crotty's book makes clear. Now, this should be evident from anyone who actually only reads of Keynes, only reads the general theory and nothing else. Because if you look at the last chapter of the general theory, the one on policy, the only one that's really focused on policy, the chapter called Concluding Notes on the Social Philosophy Towards Which the General Theory Might Lead, that's the title of the chapter, there are two policy ideas, overarching policy ideas in that chapter. And they are not deficit spending, yes, deficit spending, no, monetary policy interventions to tinker with interest rates, how much, yes, no. That's not what he has in that chapter. What are the two ideas? One is the somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment. That's number one. And the other one is euthanasia of the rentier. That is John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics, right straight out of the general theory. So it's impossible to miss it if you read Keynes. True, it's only a part of this chapter. Those ideas are not fleshed out in any detail in the general theory. And that's why Crotty's book is so important. Because in Crotty's book, he does, for the first time, a thorough treatment, an in-depth understanding and analysis of what those ideas actually mean when you get to the end of the general theory, and how Keynes had been developing them throughout his career. So what does Crotty say about this, the project? He says, Keynes's economic policy agenda was designed to create a liberal and democratic variant of a government-guided socialist economy. This government planning system did not incorporate most manufacturing and service sector corporations. Those firms that were in industries that were not oligopolistic would be left to operate in the market as before. The system did not involve state ownership of all productive assets as the Soviet Union or the Labour Party manifestos in the UK. It relied instead on large publicly owned and state-influenced enterprises that together control the lion's share of the large-scale capital stock of the country. It also included state guidance of firms with excessive market power. The centerpiece of Keynes's new policy regime was control over major capital investment projects by public and semi-public institutions through a board of national national investment. The primary objective of policy was to increase public and semi-public investment sufficiently so as to achieve and then sustain full employment over the long run, creating a dramatically improved economy and society in the process. This policy focus began to emerge in the mid-1920s and was sustained until Keynes's death in 1946. Now, why was Keynes committed to this agenda? Once we are clear as to what this agenda is, why? Why was this really what Keynes was about? Well, Crotty's book brings this out, but when we reflect on it, and Crotty's book helps us to reflect, it should be kind of obvious why somebody with Keynes's level of intelligence and humanity would reach these conclusions. We have to remember that Keynes's career spanned basically from 1914 to 1946. What happened? So we have two world wars, a Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the rise of Soviet communism. And so reflecting on the world as he was observing it, reflecting honestly, we have Keynes, and now this is Keynes, not Crotty, in his 1933 paper called National Self-Sufficiency, Keynes writes as follows: the decadent, international, but individualistic capitalism in the hands of which we found ourselves after the war, i.e. World War I, is not a success. It is not intelligent, it is not beautiful, it is not just, it is not virtuous, and it doesn't deliver the goods. This is only at the beginning of the Great Depression, by the way. In short, we dislike it and we are beginning to despise it. That's Keynes in 1933. Now, Keynes first achieves major public notice with the publication of The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In 1919, Keynes was 35 years old at the time, and he had been a participant for Britain at the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended World War I. Now, Crotty makes a point in the Economic Consequences of the Peace that Keynes actually has fleshed out a lot of his basic ideas about the sources of instability in capitalism, the inherent tendency of capitalism to land at a trajectory of secular stagnation, and that being a persistent feature of capitalism. So that's in the Economic Consequences of the Peace. I have to confess, I never got that part of Economic Consequences of the Peace, and my sense is that most readers wouldn't, because there is another idea in the Economic Consequences of the Peace that is overwhelming. And that is that Keynes, as a 35-year-old junior policy person, was the only one with the courage and intelligence to publicly denounce the Treaty of Versailles and to recognize what would be the consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. And so here's Crotty. The Economic Consequences of the Peace was written to warn the North American, European, and British public that if the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles were enforced, the world would face the prospect of economic stagnation, financial crises, rising social and political unrest, and in some countries, violent revolution. This is because the Treaty of Versailles forced draconian austerity conditions on Germany, the country defeated. Now, I've read this and I've thought about it, but rereading it on Crotty's book, I had to reflect, and I've reflected on this before. Would Hitler have arisen as a leader of Germany if not for the Treaty of Versailles? Would the Holocaust have happened if not for the Treaty of Versailles? I think the answer is no. I think the answer is no. And what that tells me is that when we're doing economics, this is serious stuff. And to have John Maynard Keynes as a 35-year-old junior economist being the only one with the brains and the courage to denounce this kind of vicious punishing austerity tells us that we have a lot to do to improve in economics, and the parallels with today are obvious. The punishing austerity programs that have been imposed in Europe. I just got back from Greece myself talking about this. Jamie himself worked on an anti-austerity program in Greece and wrote a brilliant book that I will mention a little later. Why do we think the far right is emerging strongly? Why should we be surprised after we've known the experience of imposing austerity on innocent people? That's what Keynes wrote about. He was absolutely 100% spot on. We need to remember that. Now, Crotty, back to Crotty and Keynes. So he makes the case clear that Keynes was against laissez-faire capitalism. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't just. We hate it. What was he for? And yes, his case is for something he calls liberal socialism. And as we said, at the end of the general theory, there is some discussion, brief discussion about what that means. But it is brief. And if you want to ignore it, you can ignore it. So I would say that one of the major achievements of Jim Crotty's book is to flesh this out, because Keynes had fleshed it out. It's just that people like me and most other people really didn't know this whole body of work of Keynes on this question. So Crotty develops this, and in particular, I would say chapter 8 of his book, and I assume everyone has read the book or you weren't allowed in the room. Everyone did their homework? Yeah, okay. So the chapter 8, Britain's industrial future and the Board of National Investment, a detailed analysis of the institutions to be used by the state to regulate capital accumulation in pursuit of full employment under neoliberalism. This is a brilliant chapter, and I would say it's really kind of the heart and soul of this book in terms of its new contributions. So what Crotty is arguing persuasively is, in my view, this work that Keynes had done, especially in a 1928 book called Britain's Industrial Future, really does lay out in detail his vision of liberal socialist economy. This book, he was not the sole author, he was the co-author, but Crotty really identifies the sections of the book that it was clear that Keynes had written. The book was the platform of the Liberal Party in the 1928 election. So the first thing that comes out clearly in this chapter, the Keynes work that Crotty highlights, is the argument that Keynes makes is that if we think about it, 2/3 to 3/4 of all investment, private investment in Great Britain is already under some level of control of the public sector. And this is quoting Keynes. 2/3 of the typical large-scale enterprise of this country had already been removed, mainly by conservative and liberal governments, out of the category of pure private enterprise. So it was already the case. And if we did the similar exercise in the United States right now, I don't think the numbers would be that different if we think about all forms of subsidy. Now, what Crotty then goes on to say is as follows. The major contribution to our understanding of the evolution of Keynes's thinking about state direct and indirect control of capital investment in British's industrial future is a detailed description of his proposed Board of National Investment, a permanent body that would both gather the necessary sources of finance and allocate them to pay for economically and socially efficient investment projects in a manner calculated to ensure full employment over the long run. It was not just about using public investment to kickstart the economy, as we would do in Keynes, conventional Keynesian thinking, and let private enterprise take over once again. Keynes expressed support for state control of most large-scale capital spending as the main instrument of government economic policy in many places in the general theory, but he did not tell us in detail how this could be accomplished. That is why Britain's industrial future is crucial to the defense of the main policy thesis of this manuscript, Crotty's manuscript. It is, so to speak, the smoking gun of the argument. Okay. Here's Crotty. I consider British's industrial future to be a crucial stage in the evolution of Keynes's plan for construction of liberal socialism in Britain. Now, interestingly, Crotty cites Moggeridge, who wrote a biography of Keynes called, quote, an economist's biography of Keynes. Moggeridge, as Crotty says, apparently thought it to be of such little significance, British's industrial future, that he devoted only a page and a half to it in his 800-plus page economist biography of Keynes. So why don't people know that Keynes was a liberal socialist and had actually fleshed out these ideas in great depth? Because people like Moggeridge completely ignore it. So thank you to Jim Crotty for your contributions in making this clear. Also, yes, Skidelsky, whatever, 3,000 pages. Yeah. So what is really the thrust of this chapter in Crotty? So he says as follows. For our purposes, this is Crotty, the most interesting aspects of the book are, one, it supported the proposal by Keynes and Lloyd George in 1924 for reliance on public investment as the foundation of macro policy in pursuit of sustained full employment, and provided for the first time supporting institutional detail for the implementation of this policy centered around a national board of investment. And two, it reflected Keynes's multidimensional approach to the solution of Britain's economic problems in this period, relying not only on public investment and capital controls, but also on state-guided industrial policies and redistribution of wealth. Keynes is not just focused, however, on industrial policy. Obviously, he's also focused on issues around labor and social justice. So, for example, he then says, the potentially this is Crotty describing this work by Keynes, the potentially destructive force of class antagonism in industry receives careful attention. In addition to labor representation on industry-wide industrial relation boards, the book proposes a more egalitarian distribution of both private wealth and public services to reduce class distinctions and class tensions, as well as mandatory reporting of business costs and profits so that unions would know to what extent companies were treating them fairly. In addition, combining thinking about industrial policy and labor relations, Crotty talks about Keynes talking about the industries that are going to be contracting over time. And he says, solving the unemployment problem in export trades that are losing their market share was made especially difficult by the fact that the capital employed there was substantially immobile. But, and here's Crotty emphasizing Keynes, he says, labor is also burdened by irreversibility. Jobs are location-specific and skill-specific. Housing is location specific and may plummet in value when a dominant local industry such as mining or shipbuilding or steel production goes into depression. Workers and their families are also part of social networks that are central to their well-being. This is not, in other words, a situation in which the decline of some particular industry is easily resolved by the free movement of redundant capital and labor from declining into expanding industries. So this is about what we now call, when we talk about the clean energy transition, a just transition for workers and communities. So Keynes was onto this way back, and Crotty thankfully emphasizes this. Keynes in this book also goes into details on the types of firms to be nationalized under public-private partnerships. So, by the way, one of the interesting things in the book and in Keynes is an affirmative view on public-private partnerships. These are kind of often thought of as PPPs are like, you know, a pejorative and the way many of us use it, but Keynes was actually quite high on the potential for integrating public and private partnerships. Now, one of the issues when we talk about public investment and public firms is how do you set up an incentive structure that is meaningful when we don't know what the objective function, if we say the objective function is social well-being as opposed to a corporation where the objective, we all know the objective is to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. So how do you handle incentive structures? And Keynes says that this, and Crotty emphasizes, this actually is not a real serious problem. And here's Keynes on this. The notion that the only way to get enough effort out of the brain worker is to offer him, not him or her, to offer him unfettered opportunities of making an unlimited fortune is as baseless as the companion notion that the only way of getting enough effort out of the manual worker is to hold over him the perpetual threat of starvation and misery for himself and those he loves. It has never been supposed to be true, at all events in England, of the soldier, the statesman, the civil servant, the teacher, the scientist, the technical expert. And then finally, with respect to this industrial planning board, the integration of industrial policy, labor policy, then yields a macro policy for full employment. And here's Crotty on Keynes. When the capital investment and financing decisions relating to this huge and diverse set of undertakings is brought under the coordination of a board of national investment, the ability to achieve sustained or long-term full employment would be within reach. The board would regulate public capital investment in pursuit of the goal of sustained full employment, thus defeating the destructive forces of both secular stagnation and dysfunctional disequilibrium processes. And here, critically, what is the impact on private investment? If the board was successful, the smaller private sector would also prosper. Expectations of future sales and profits would rise substantially, and uncertainty about future demand substantially would be lowered, increasing the private incentive to invest. Okay, to sum up, Crotty now says, to sum up, through his contribution to British's industrial future, Keynes made a major effort to implement a peaceful economic revolution in Britain's economy in the face of bitter opposition from finance, industry, government, conservatives, some members of the Liberal Party, and most of the wealthy. Okay, finally, what about relevance for today, which Crotty deals with in his last chapter, which kind of channels Keynes's last chapter in the general theory. So the last chapter of Crotty's book, chapter 23, thoughts on the relevance of Keynes's work to solving today's problems. The society-economy nexus, methodology, theory, and policy. And here's how Crotty begins the chapter. There is an alternative way to structure the relation between economy and society. Let society dominate the society-economy nexus. Start from assumptions about what kind of society the citizens of a country would like to have, as determined through effective democratic processes, and then ask what kinds of economic institutions and policies would be consistent with and supportive of the reproduction of the values and priorities of the good society or economic and social justice. In the post-World War II era, a number of countries have attempted to institutionalize the dominance of society over economy. The social democratic Nordic countries are prime examples. But as the global neoliberal regime strengthened in recent decades, its incentives and constraints have weakened societal control over the economy, even in these nations. So one of my old professors, Bob Heilbrunner, and co-author of Jamie, had a phrase that he liked to refer to in his version of socialism, which he called it slightly imaginary Sweden. Now, slightly imaginary Sweden, we cannot only slightly imagine it anymore, because Sweden itself has retreated, as Crotty emphasizes as the book closes. So Crotty is saying, how times have changed. Social democracy is in retreat almost everywhere. Authoritarian oligarchs are on the rise in many nominally democratic countries, including the USA. And the globally integrated neoliberal system institutionally empowers rich investors and multinational corporations to punish any country that does not play by their preferred rules of the game. This means that control over the economy is passing from democratic processes that at least had the potential to help society control the economy through the political process to economic policy regimes that serve the interests of giant corporations and the rich. The evidence of this is everywhere. Okay, we don't want to end there, Jim, do we? What do we do about it? So Jim does have some proposals. I'm just about done. Number one, we first have to have, he has 4 proposals. We need to do better economics. We need more realistic theories of the performance of the capitalist economy, straightforward. At a bare minimum, we need to stop celebrating austerity mongers. There are some. They're at these obscure institutions like Harvard University, economics department. There was these people called Reinhardt and Rogoff. And then there was some crazy graduate student that figured out that Reinhardt and Rogoff's work was just wrong. Even if you liked austerity, it was wrong. And guess what? There he is, Thomas Herndon. But it's not just Thomas who's done UMass. There's an excellent article in a recent issue of American Prospect, edited by Bob Kuttner, by 2 of our other distinguished graduates, Arjun Jayadev and Josh Mason, attacking Alesina, the other big Harvard austerity monger. And in case you've noticed, yes, Arjun and Josh did a great review of Alesina's book, A Critique. One of the more favorable treatments of the Alesina book was by this other guy at Harvard named Kenneth Rogoff. Okay, so that's number one. We need to gain control over what Keynes calls and Crotty reiterates many times, insane financial markets, hugely liquid financial markets. And I will not dwell on that because we have 3 brilliant experts that will be talking about this very, very soon. And hopefully they'll have a chance to talk about their books. Number 3, we have to be focused on inequality, a topic that Jamie has worked on with great distinction. And inequality, of course, exacerbates injustice. It is itself a form of injustice. But in addition to that, and this is one of the major findings of Keynes, which then Crotty highlights, that inequality also destabilizes the operations of the economy. A more egalitarian society can grow faster because of higher propensity to consume and less money to move into the gambling casino. And then finally, the last point Crotty ends with about global integration. The extreme degree of global economic and financial integration under today's neoliberal order makes it extraordinarily difficult for any country to experiment with major institutional and structural changes in its political economy that are opposed by large corporations and the wealthy. Capital controls and managed trade, topics that we'll be coming to in a bit, are necessarily but hardly sufficient conditions for society to substantially increase their control over their own national economic outcomes in today's global neoliberal capitalism. And that is the last sentence of Crotty's book. The trouble is, Crotty tells us that these are necessary but hardly sufficient. So what are the sufficient conditions? What are the conditions that we need to pursue? Jim leaves that as an open question. And since he's not here, we are not going to get an answer out of him today. So we will have to hear from our other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bob. I'm just going to take a moment to introduce our two discussants. I would like to say that I had the great privilege of studying with Jim Crotty and count him as a dear friend and an inspiration. I know Gerald is also a student of Jim Crotty's. We have two very distinguished discussants. The first is Robert Kuttner. I know we're all very familiar with his work. He is the co-founder and the editor of the American Prospect, and he's also the Meyer and Ida Kirstein Professor at Brandeis University. And I know many of us have been following and assigning his work for many years. The second discussant is Gary Dinsky, again, a fellow former student of Jim Crotty's, and Gary is a professor at the Leeds University Business School. And we'll hear from Bob first, and then Gary. Thanks. Each have about 15 minutes.
Thanks so much. It really is an honor to have been invited to this. I will try and explain in 15 minutes what the sufficient conditions are. As Jim Crotty reminds us, the all too successful effort of orthodox economics to Bowdlerize Keynes is one of intellectual history's great acts of hijacking. In order to domesticate the radical Keynes into a tame and safe Marshallian, with the state doing little more than manipulating aggregate demand, it was necessary to strip Keynes of his humanism, his radicalism, his understanding of economics as unfolding in historic time, and his understanding of uncertainty and systemic instability and fragility, especially in finance, and his grasp of the role of politics. The worst sin of all, I think, was to render a body of work that was quintessentially one of political economy into something merely technical. If you wanted a full employment economy in a democracy, Keynes appreciated, you had to come to grips with political power. You needed to euthanize the rentier, not just to get to zero interest rates, but to prevent capitalists as a class from holding on to the heights of political power and therefore preventing any such policy from being pursued. Keynes deeply appreciated that reality from having spent his political life doing battle with the Treasury view and the political power of the city. And as Crotty reminds us, Kalecki's famous 1943 article on the political economy of full employment argued that in a capitalist economy, there was no technical obstacle to getting to full employment, but that the capitalists would never let you do it. All of which was why you needed something like liberal socialism. Now, Keynes, as Jim Crotty reminds us, favored planning, substantial socialization of investment, not just in depressions, the repression of private finance, and so on, so that the interest rate could gradually drop to zero for public purposes. It's worth noting that in the United States today, we have an interest rate effectively of zero, but in very different circumstances of hypercapitalism and hyperfinancialization, in which zero interest rates are used not to develop the real economy, but to supercharge speculation and leave the economy prone to even more crashes. Although in China, very low and even negative interest rates are used more along public Keynesian lines. Indeed, Keynes's call for government guidance of public and private finance sounds more like China than like anything else in the West. However, China today is the antithesis both of liberal capitalism and of liberal socialism. I should add that given the hegemony of the business class and the destruction of labor bargaining power, both through the assault on unions and through what my colleague David Weil at Brandeis has termed the fishing of the workplace, full employment has a very different meaning today than it did in the age of Keynes and Beveridge. In that era, it was axiomatic that full employment would significantly increase labor bargaining power and therefore go a long way towards dealing with the problem of decent wages. This was also true in the 1960s in the debates over whether the Great Society should stress anti-poverty, as most of LBJ's advisors successfully urged, or whether it should stress full employment, as urged by Minsky, Walter Reuther, A. Philip Randolph, and John Kenneth Galbraith. By targeting the poor, even the liberals around LBJ were using a deficiency model of poverty rather than using full employment to create jobs, something Minsky never tired of pointing out. But today, in the context of hypercapitalism, the rules have been so tilted against labor that we can have unemployment rates of below 4%, which Keynes considered full employment, without any appreciable impact on wages. This is all the more reason to appreciate Keynes's view, as recovered and synthesized by Crotty, that the Keynesian enterprise is not about stabilizing capitalism. That's a fool's errand in a political economy where the capitalists retain the political power to make the rules. Rather, it's about pursuing liberal socialism. Now, Crotty is far from the first to object to the neutering of Keynes into the so-called neoclassical paradigm. Joan Robinson famously wrote about bastard Keynesianism. Minsky, of course, was relentless on the subject of the systematic fragility and instability of finance. My friend Will Hutton in 1984 wrote a splendid non-technical book called The Revolution That Never Was, about how Keynesianism was never really adopted. But Jim's book is both the most comprehensive as well as the first to give us a fully fleshed appreciation, not just of what Keynes was against, but what Keynes was for. Another great contribution is the fact that in the mainstream neutering of Keynes, the general theory and Keynes's other great works are often dismissed, not as a true comprehensive theory, but as a grab bag of insights and conjectures, sometimes at odds with one another. Crotty's great achievement is to demonstrate the coherence and the consistency of Keynes's overall view that because of the systematic underinvestment and misinvestment and sheer human waste, that Keynesian, the capitalism had to give way to something like liberal socialism. Another really important contribution, it seems to me, is the fact that the so-called neoclassical synthesis contended that something called macroeconomics was a special idiosyncratic exception to the general efficiency of markets. The entire economy could get stuck at an equilibrium well below its potential, but the rest of standard economics, price theory and microeconomics, lived splendidly on. In fact, Keynes impeaches microeconomics as well. A market economy not only experienced periodic crashes and depressions at the macro level, but central to that problem was the propensity at the micro level of systematic mispricing of everything from financial securities to public goods, to education, to health, to R&D, and of course, pollution. Nicholas Stern famously described global climate change as history's greatest case of market failure. So true Keynesianism demolishes price theory as well. Keynes also, as Bob said, insisted that democracy was a national enterprise. Orthodox economists have often treated Keynes's 1933 essay on national self-sufficiency as a kind of youthful indiscretion and an unfortunate lapse in the career of someone who was otherwise a free trader. Nothing could be further from the truth. Keynes appreciated that international capital flows, international speculation, was a very potent instrument against the ability of democracies, which by definition have to exist at the level of the nation state to manage the economy. And if you look at Bretton Woods, that was the central objective and insight of Bretton Woods, that we had to make it possible for national economies to run high employment economies free from the undertow of international private financial speculation. Danny Roderick and my own work both emphasize that both democracy and the governance of capital have to occur nationally. Otherwise, the global privileges and speculative urges of capital will fatally undermine the project of getting to full employment. Now, Keynes's theory of democracy, I would say, was somewhat underdeveloped in great detail, but it was implicit. That is, he doesn't go into great detail on the political capture of the state by private finance, something that is essentially doomed the post-war compromise of managed capitalism or the mixed economy. But he certainly understood that the political power of private capital was every bit as much a problem as the economic power. One contemporary who needs to be read with Keynes is Polanyi, who suffered something of the same fate of Keynes at the hands of the orthodoxy. Polanyi's basic insight, of course, was that when market forces overwhelm the rest of society, the workers of the world do not unite, rather they turn to ultranationalists and fascists. Now, Polanyi came of age as a journalist in his beloved Red Vienna. And while Polanyi revered socialist Vienna, he understood that we could not have islands of durable socialism in a capitalist sea. And so, just as the orthodoxy sought to tame and neutralize Keynes, a similar effort occurred with Polanyi. His masterwork, The Great Transformation, was rediscovered in part thanks to a 1982 article by John Ruggie, which coined the phrase embedded liberalism. And by that, Ruggie, invoking Polanyi's work on decommodification, meant that the post-war social settlement basically preserved economic liberalism, an essentially market economy, but embedded it in national, social, and democratic structures. While this may have been an accurate description of the post-war compromise, it was a perversion of what Polanyi himself believed, because like Keynes, Polanyi was a democratic socialist. He was no more about stabilizing capitalism than Keynes was. He understood that capitalism would overwhelm attempts to harness or housebreak it unless you supplanted it with something like liberal socialism. And I guess another member of this pantheon of great heterodox thinkers, Albert Hirschman, liked to describe himself as a trespasser, one who crossed disciplinary boundaries with a gleeful sense of transgression. Keynes really, if you think about it, was the ultimate trespasser, not only an economist, but a pamphleteer, a historian, a humanist. And as a magazine editor who assigns and edits articles by people from different disciplines, I get to be something of a trespasser. And I'm always amazed at how different literatures in different scholarly fields, working on essentially the same set of problems, often talk past each other and often are not even aware of each other. For instance, in the field of political science, about 20 years ago, there arose a very influential school called Varieties of Capitalism. This school essentially divided the West into three types of capitalism, which they called liberal market economies, the Anglo-Saxon countries, neo-corporatist coordinated market economies, France and Germany, and social market economies such as Scandinavia. And some of these people even consider themselves left-wing. And so there were debates about convergence versus divergence. Are these three models still going to be able to persist, or is neoliberalism turning them all into one model? History, of course, has solved that question. Neoliberalism is turning all of the experiments in managed capitalism, or rather mild social democracy that thrived in the post-war period, into it's not laissez-faire capitalism, because there are lots of rules, but they're rules captured and written by and for financial elites. But meanwhile, what is really becoming the dominant model of capitalism, and Branko Milanović's new book is the text on this, is autocratic, kleptocratic, oligarchic, semi-capitalism, semi-authoritarianism. And if there's going to be a convergence, the convergence is less a question of whether the United States and the democracies of Scandinavia converge into some watered down form of social democracy, but whether the United States and Russia, and we can argue about China later, are going to converge into corrupt authoritarian capitalism. I wrote a book last year called Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? And my answer was no. Global capitalism is destroying democracy on two flanks. On the one flank, globalism is removing key decisions about wealth and income and investment and regulation from the realm of national democratic deliberation and enforcing a regime of austerity, thus weakening democracy directly. And on the other flank, a popular backlash against these results that have been so harmful to the life horizons and prospects and security of ordinary people brings to power leaders like Trump and Orban and Erdogan and Boris Johnson. So my answer to my own question is that if we want democracy to survive, we need a lot more democracy and a lot less capitalism. One aspect of capitalism, it seems to me, that Marx and Keynes both underappreciated is its power to keep adapting and mutating and capturing politics, making it that much harder to housebreak. All this is all the more reason to rediscover liberal socialism, not just to save the economy, but to save democracy. And I think we can thank Jim Crotty for a superb text on how to do that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bob, for those reflections. We are next going to hear from Gary Dinsky.
Does it work? Excellent. I'm going to use a PowerPoint to guide my reflections. Mainly, I like it for several reasons. One is that it allows me to discipline my time. Secondly, it allows me to make sure that you're looking at it, not my face. And so that's helpful. And so let's go. We're going to start with just a page of reflection on Jim as a former student. How many people here have ever sat in a classroom with Bob Poland? Oh, Bob Poland? Excuse me, with Bob Poland for one. How about Jim Crotty? I'm so sorry. Okay, so the experience is one that you'll have to imagine. Let's see if we, okay. Here we go. Imagine a man who looks like he came out of the 1950s, who did actually, sitting with the same blue shirt, of which he must have an infinite number, the same tan pants, sitting on the edge of a desk, perched there, reading the texts of great thinkers that he's been reflecting on before the class and the previous night, and then basically asking us what we make of the thoughts in those insights. That's Jim. So Jim would teach by questions. He would ask us what we thought it meant and put it out on the table. Now, Marx and Keynes were both his avatars, as you know. But Keynes, I mean, the difference is that Marx was kind of, the master in the background, but Keynes was the person of this century. And so in some sense, he becomes Jim's muse. And this book really puts it all together. Now, the pathways here are into the complexity of what Jim thinks are there for us to see. And I would just say that, in some sense, this idea of questions, I want to just pick up one thing from Jim. in the way that he proceeded. We always ask questions, but if you want to basically pursue your question, you've got to propose an answer and you've got to interrogate your answer. And so in this case, I just want to say, first of all, U.S. out of Vietnam. Jim was fired at SUNY Buffalo for his opposition to the Vietnam War. He then went to Bucknell and ended up at UMass Amherst. And so here's another, there's an assertion, U.S. out of Vietnam. Here's another one, Keynes was a socialist. Okay, now I'm going to do just 3 parts here, maybe 4. The first is just to talk about the question of was Keynes a socialist, just bringing a couple of things up. I want to highlight this interesting younger scholar who my son Jamal is reading, the Jacobin and the Socialist Manifesto by Sunkara. There's a generation of people, including my students now in their 20s and 30s, who are reclaiming this idea of what is socialism in a very interesting way. Now, Sunkara mentions Keynes only once, and notice that even in the one sentence he has about him, there's this ambiguity. A little who believes socialists were well-intentioned idiots who presented the best approach of the time to taming capitalism. Now, Jeff Mann is a book that probably people here don't know. Jeff is a geographer up in British Columbia, but he's written an extremely interesting book called In the Long Run, We're All Dead that links Keynes to Robespierre and to Hegel in a way that basically argues that there's this search for order, and he argues that it has to be led by an elite, which is a point that we'll come back to. And then I've got a couple of, just a page here, a couple of quotes from different Skidelsky reflections on Keynes as socialist. And here's Skidelsky and the Return of the Master. And you can kind of see, the ambiguity of the way that Skidelsky treats Keynes. He was not an uncritical admirer of capitalism. It was a necessary stage to get societies from poverty to abundance, after which its usefulness would disappear. This makes him close to the Karl Marx of the manifesto. But he didn't look forward to violent overthrow. He wanted to preserve capitalism. This underpins his politics of the middle way. So we see, really Skidelsky struggling with how to describe what this is. And I've gotten to know Bob a little bit, and I think that sense of inner struggle is there with him as he goes through. The thing I want to highlight from the last book by Bob, Money and Government, 2018, is this where he comes back to the idea of Keynes's theory was the economics of the middle way. So Crotty, however, gives us lots of evidence that Keynes was more decided than this. And Bob has done a great job at going through some of the quotes that Jim has done. And notice that one thing is, it's a Crotty book. It's full of quotes from Keynes. And so it's just like being in his class. Read the quote, think about it, and then come back and see what Crotty says about it. It's a kind of simulation of that experience. And basically here, interestingly, he picks up John R. Commons and talks about the fact that basically new liberalism, or this, liberal socialism, is the way forward to steer this middle course. Okay, now to the meat of it. I decided to focus. I've been working on the UK productivity project and on the UK rebuilding macro project. Very complicated ventures, I have to say. And so I was especially drawn to the chapter that Bob described as being the heart of the book, where he talks about the plans for British industry. And in some sense, Jim also then uses that as a fulcrum. And then with that, he pulls ideas that he then reproduces and explores farther as he goes along, more or less following Keynes's historical trajectory. And so I want to identify 6 items that were fundamental to let's call them the fundamental elements of Keynes's plans. We'll then look at whether those conditions are, whether those could hold today as elements. We'll then look at some of the underlying preconditions and whether those hold. Okay, so kind of lining up a description of what this liberal socialist plan would be for Keynes. First of all, as mentioned in Britain's industrial future, you need a board of national investment. You need state control over the economy. Secondly, you have to have people in your ministries who know what they're doing and are capable of this. Jim has a nice section about describing how Keynes thought that at some point the Bank of England had enough expertise that they could do it. And I remember listening to Jim Carvalho for many years and his questioning of whether the Brazilian PT government had that expertise and ultimately having some problems. Third point, you need adequate levels of aggregate demand. You want to level up, not down, and again, Bob's hit this point. A fourth point is interesting, that you don't want to rely on deficit spending. You want to rely on public investment instead. And fifth point, basically the shift toward domestic industry and consumers. This is that famous 1933 speech and article. And finally, interestingly, use available finance to finance national industry. Jim refers a couple of times, and I remember now I'm British, right? So I've got this in my bones, these terminologies, sinking fund. But I always felt that I didn't understand sinking fund because I was American reading a British book. But in some sense, there's a couple points where Jim refers to this, and there's a reference to the idea that sinking funds that were being put aside to repay Britain's war debt could be repurposed. Now, that's interesting in light of where we are now. Okay, all these defining elements are problematic today. First of all, the Board of National Investment idea didn't even survive that debate. As Bob points out, you have to look through to see which parts of that plan Keynes wrote and which he didn't. Even the liberal democratic agenda put forward was already off the table. It was too problematic. Secondly, there's a huge problem of expertise. I'm going to use kind of UK as my model here because I've been working on the UK economy. We don't have the people. The example is the British have no people anymore that know how to do trade negotiations. That's all been offloaded to the EU. So wait for that as you're holding your breath for Brexit. Thirdly, we've had, of course, 10 years of macro austerity. The economic data are good, apparently good, but this hides many things. And again, I'm following my predecessor speakers on this. There's an aversion to deficit spend into the idea of public investment. After so many years of Thatcherism, new laborism, you should see the attacks on labor's program. Now, we've got something to say about that, but let's hold that for now. The integration of industrial production across borders. Everybody and their brothers and sisters in my business school works on global supply chains. This is a huge issue right now. Even when some part of production remains domestically produced, the localization of industrial production is problematic. Keeping, for example, Leeds' tradition of manufacturing, which is very strong and very deep, is now linked to companies owned on the continent. And finally, repurposing committed finance so as to achieve national priorities contradicts the rules of the road that we now have. And here, a big shout out to Jane, who's taught me a lot about this, because we're going to talk about now the problems with the supporting conditions that underlie this plan. First two, we're just going to mention that I want to go into a little bit of depth and I'll finish up. The Crotty makes this excellent point, and he points us to the idea of where are you? Are you in an inflationary or deflationary period? And what does that mean, especially focusing on distributional consequences? He points out that for Keynes, he's thinking about whether the rentiers or the entrepreneurs, so to speak, will be benefiting from these different conditions. And we would just note that this is of course a huge change. We have the world at which Keynes was railing in the 20s being a world of deflation with the gold standard there. Then we move, of course, to the chronic inflation world of the 70s and 80s. And now we're back in deflation, post-crisis, quantitative easing, and zero lower bound, as Bob's pointed out. The next thing to say is the national control over finance is problematic. Now, Bob Kuttner did an excellent job at talking all about this. And just to say, this idea of repurposing sinking fund commitments, past conduct and reusing them, has been replaced by this, since the 1980s, by this soft law global governance of market-based credit practices. by too big to fail mega banks, shadow banks, in cooperation with the G20 now and the IFIs. And we moved from Brady bonds, where the system was set up, to subprime lending and so on, and securitization, and now to climate bonds and other things. Now, the next 2 points I want to pick up to just elaborate just a little bit in my remaining couple of minutes. The first one is the acknowledged importance of balancing trade and financial flows among nations, which was there embedded in the texts of Keynes and in his thinking, especially as he prepared Britain for its post-empire conditions. That's changed. And thirdly, the idea of development as a big push is also problematic. Now, global imbalances were once seen as problematic. National balance was a goal, but the post-Bretton world has thrived on these imbalances. Again, Bob Kuttner's really laid this out, but just to say that U.S. cross-border imbalances provide us the architecture of international goods and capital flows. This is almost the defining moment for what neoliberalism is. I was at the Brookings for a year, 85 and 86, and people were talking about the global in the famous Brookings lunchroom, about the global comparative advantage of the U.S. in consumption. They were referring to Jörg Niehaus, the Johns Hopkins economist, his nth country theory. It's like Walras' law of international finance. Everybody got to be disciplined but you. So you can do what you want. We then moved to the savings glut. We now move to this horrible literature on the shortage of safe assets by Caballero and others. And as Jim would say, don't get me started on that one. But there's no will to fix this. China doesn't have the leverage. Its Belt and Road Initiative is representing its own separate path, but it's not positioned to make a change at the level of the global system. There's no will in the US, there's none in Europe. Germany is systematically underinvesting in its infrastructure while retaining its export orientation and hanging on for dear life while doing technology transfer with China. It's not going to last forever, but that's where they are now. And underneath all of this, of course, is secular stagnation. And we come back to Sweezy and so on. Now, development. I want to just highlight this marvelous sentence I found the other day from Irma Adelman and her co-author, Erin Yeldon, in, I think, a journal that you've edited, Jamie, the Structural Change in Economic Dynamics. 2000 article called, Is This the End of Economic Development? Now, this is writing right here. In one sentence, actually two, she basically just lays out an entire critique. The openness and nature of short-term financial markets eliminate state use of interest and exchange rate policies, while the GATT and WTO eliminate trade and commercial policy. As a result, developing countries are severely limited in the means they can employ to promote development. Yeah, got it, problem. Since 2000, what we see is instead bottom-up approaches. We see the Grameen experiment, we see Banerjee and Duflo, poor economics and all that. We also see insurrectionist circular economy approaches, imaginaries. But the idea that the state, so that they're not looking at the state, they're looking beneath it. But the idea that the state has had its day and needs to be surpassed is in the mind of global capital. And let me skip there's just a discussion here about the post-capitalism circular economy peoples. And a couple of texts. Here's one of the texts that's been influential in some of the students and colleagues in the Labor Party and so on. Look at that list. 4 minimal demands: full automation, reduction of the working week, the provision of a basic income, and the diminishment of the work ethic as a plan for the next phase. That's a post-state plan. The problem is that in the meantime, and this will be my final 2 points, plans are being developed at the level of global finance. I was just at the UN in Geneva, and this agreement on sustainable development goals, the Addis Ababa agenda, the Paris Accords, and so on, there's an estimate that we need $2.5 trillion, 3% of GDP, world GDP, to take care of these things. Thus far, the numbers don't add up. They're not enough. So the solution is being called blended finance. That means leveraging private capital with public funds that will absorb the risks. And they'll have to be basically scaled up. Now, there is already a plan. In fact, I explore this and I go there and see in October 2018, a G20 eminent persons group has laid out this plan. It's called Making the Global Financial System Work for All. 3-level system. IMF, its board at the top, control and surveillance. The IFIs will coordinate their efforts of everybody, and they'll shift from making loans to making guarantees. And meanwhile, private finance will provide the juice, and these bonds will be de-risked with the risks held by the multinational development banks and by nation states. If you think that's going to work, just imagine. Talk about the destruction of democracy. Final 2 paragraphs, Ilene. I'm sorry for that. This is a post-state, nation-state project. The role of national governments and multilateral banks is there. National democracies are already being eaten out from the inside. Restoring democracy means protecting the nation state. A shift from capitalism to liberal socialism on a global stage, nation by nation, region by region, block by block. There's really no alternative. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Bob and Gary, for your interesting reflections, and Bob Poland for his earlier introduction of the book. We've got about 10 minutes for discussion. And I will call on people if you want to raise comments to particular speakers. Just grab that. Yeah, Nina.
Each presentation was great. What I really enjoyed about Kuttner and Dinsky's comments really emphasizing the power element that undergirds Crotty's discussion of Keynes. So we think about the power of who sets the rules, and I think about this a lot in the context of Germany's critiques of the ECB right now as being insufficiently independent because suddenly its decisions are counter to what German executive board members are demanding, and all the consequences of this. And I'm curious how we can adequately link up the progressive radical economic vision with these other disciplines. How do we better trespass as economists in ways that will more sustainably integrate these ideas in ways that are so important?
Well, let me take a stab. If the economy is basically capitalist with an overlay management, regulation, welfare state, then you're basically left with countervailing power, and you need an incredibly strong labor movement so that you have social democratic governments in power most of the time, which only describes Sweden for maybe 50 years. And in the heyday of the labor movement in the United States, virtually every member of Congress who was a Democrat outside the South was pro-labor, so that you had some countervailing support for a managed form of capitalism. You lose that, the game's over, which I think is why you have to go beyond countervailing institutions to counterbalance the power of finance in a capitalist economy and go for the throat and have more of the economy socialized. And I think the brilliance of Keynes, as explained by Crotty, is that he's not talking about state socialism. And he's talking about the connection between liberal socialism and democracy. And he's leaving some room for a vibrant private sector because we need entrepreneurs, but he is emasculating its political power, or he's trying to. Now, how you get from this mess that we are in which a lot of working class people think that the enemy is not the 1%, they think the enemy is immigrants, and they think the enemy is people of different races and ethnic groups, to where we need to get, that's a subject for another conference. But I think you start out by getting very serious about power.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. Remember at UMass, if you were Keynesian, you were suspected of being soft. right? And right, and so the thing, what we see Jim do here, and actually I've just been reflecting on Jim Carvalho's work too, is he goes into the text and he extracts that and then links it to these broader commitments. It reminds us that, because if we're talking to some of the economists, we need to use that language. That would be the first thing, is that power is there, and actually the recognition of the role of power within our own frameworks and opening that to interdisciplinary dialogue. That's something I started to work on, and that's something that we need, because we need those alliances across disciplinary lines. Second thing is, there are changes afoot. Of course, Europe will collapse if it remains as it is, stuck between region and nation. The recent election in the Social Democratic Party in Germany is a sign of hope. But the dirigism of France versus the old school Christian Democrats of Germany, that's cracking at the seams. And in fact, the strike in France also shows. So everything is in motion with a lot of heat and a lot of instability, and more to come, I'm afraid.
And by the way, when you take your first course in economics, if you're taking a course in orthodox economics, the first thing they do is they assume away power. Think about that.
Your next meeting.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on one point raised by Gary, which is the international dimension. And I maybe provocatively heard you say, like, oh, this is an issue that we have to also deal with. But I'm wondering whether in the year 2019, this isn't an integral issue that challenges us to rethink the proposals of Keynes from the perspective of how can we make this work, given the very deep global value chain integration. And I think that if we look at the US-China question, that becomes pretty pertinent, because we see that many people on the progressive side actually seem to be just as anti-China as on the right-wing side. Now, if we want to prevent a slide into fascism or proto-fascism, or at least prevent the rise of the right, it seems that we need to have an answer to this very strong anti-China, xenophobic, anti-outsourcing of production kind of notion, right? So I'm wondering what the panelists are thinking about the global dimension that is so deeply ingrained in the organization of capitalism as we face it today.
Great, maybe I'll just ask the panelists to just hold for one moment, and there was one other comment in the interest of time, the great top, and maybe then we'll collect.
Yeah, and so this is just a question, and I think in answering Isabel's question, you might be able to add it in. Gary, I took a picture of the slides that you had done where there was like the 6 key features for Keynes' plan for industry, and I'm just going over the 6 again, and I notice a couple of things. One, there's a very notable reliance on the state institutions, state expertise, planning of a certain kind, a sort of indirect planning that's not sort of centralized, kind of Soviet-style control, and a sort of socialization of the institutions and processes that we do associate with capitalism, if not a complete sort of transcendence of them. And I guess I wonder, for those of us who operate in progressive circles, who are engaged either in party politics on the left or in kind of activist circles on the left, or both, perhaps. Is this sort of uniquely situated within left circles itself? That is to say, I mean, what sorts of opposition are we encountering from the left? I could think of the kind of traditional Soviet state planning, centralized planning answer, which I think I've seen in Jacobin circles. But I can also think of that anti-state element on the left, which also exists. I mean, is there a need to sort of solidify this within the left in kind of progressive circles as well? Because I'm thinking there might be just, I mean, even in the book we're talking about, Keynes kind of comparing himself to the Labour Party and situating himself in the British liberal tradition instead. I'm curious how that might reflect today.
Great, maybe last question, Jovik in the back of the room, and then everyone 1 minute to respond.
Continuing on this international aspect of Keynes, I just want to bring into the notice of the panel a recent article by Professor Utsav Patnaik on Keynes, discussing how Keynes was responsible, like he was given during, we were talking about this World War and all that, that Keynes was also stayed in a period where British colonized many countries, especially India, and Keynes was given the responsibility of Indian economy during the 1940s along with Cato. And it seems like Utsapanak makes this connection that Keynes orchestrated policies which were responsible for another Holocaust, which happened in undivided Bengal when 3 million people died in pain. And so this international aspect of Keynes, which I'm sure I'll be able to ask Mr. Crotty, but I just wanted to know that can liberal socialism be seen along with something internationalist angles, or can Keynes be really viewed in that sense as a liberal socialist?
Hold on, why don't we just go down the line if anyone wants to make a comment?
Okay, so I'll just comment on the points raised by Isabella and Shovik. And I'm very sympathetic, which is exactly why I ended my talk. Well, the book itself, Crotty's book, conveniently does end on this point, on the emphasis on controlling international capitalism and refocusing on national capitalism. And he says, Crotty says, this is necessary but not sufficient, hardly sufficient. But Jim, let's just say he doesn't really flesh this out. To be fair, this is, I would not say, is the strong point of the book, but that reflects a broader issue, which is these are very difficult questions. It would have been nice if Jim were here and he could give us the answers. But we, we on the left have to deal with these in a much more comprehensive way. I mean, we have to recognize workers in China should not be considered the enemy. The fact that whatever else we may think about China, that living standards have gone up, whatever, 9-fold, you're the expert, 8-fold, 7-fold, whatever it is. And it has raised more people out of destitution than any other event in world history. I think we have to recognize this as a positive feature of what's happened in the last 40 years and go from there. And similarly with respect to immigration, Perry Anderson actually spoke at PERI a year ago. It was a brilliant lecture in which he said, well, we have the populist right and the populist left that actually have similar positions on several things. He said, but on the one thing that is this massive departure, the populist right is anti-immigrant and the populist left could never be anti-immigrant because it's immoral. It's immoral. But then now what do we do about it? And what do we do about the fact that, there is labor market competition that results from the integration of people in low-wage countries, whether they come as immigrants or whether it happens through trade and value chains? What's the answer? I don't know, or maybe I might know, but I only have 8 seconds left, so I will leave it.
Gary?
Yeah, first on that last question, obviously that's a hole in Keynes's work, and it's a hole in this book. And notice that last plan that I showed, the neoliberal global finance plan, is one in which massive destruction, further destruction could be done on developing economies around the world, holding this over their heads, and then advanced nations being surprised why the flow of immigrants remains ever more strong, destabilizing nation states here and there as well. I would just say, have a look at David Edgerton's new book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, which is about the British industrialization process. It's a piece that would add to the richness of it for us to ask, because Edgerton argues that there's been this stepping away from what that was, and there's a critique there that reminds us of some of the critical reviews by Fine and others over the years about a British commitment to finance capital. On the question of dialogues and discussions, we've actually been in touch in my Rebuilding Macro. We've had dialogues with Extinction Rebellion, and they're oppositional to the idea of state power, but there's a need, an understanding. They're looking to us to help with a strategic plan. Now that's different to the group of embedded experts, and believe me, I've been encountering some of the embedded and empowered treasury experts in the course of my work, and it's just like you're back in the 1920s as far as a sense of privilege and the guarding of the state jewels. But I think that there's an opening there, and I think we have to embrace it. The labor plan is an opening. I'm sorry, in the treasury, it's one funeral at a time. But there's an opening in terms of people engaged at the local level in environmental reproduction and the post-growth, post-capitalist degrowth crowd. We're gathering them together in the UK, and there are people sitting at the table. In fact, Terry Barker is going to do a conference that it'd be great to have you there in May at Cambridge to talk about all that. So those openings are there for us to talk together. I think the labor plan right now is a kind of weird mixture of the fully automated capitalism approach with the state socialism approach that is one reason why it's been kind of greeted in different and complicated ways. Finally, on China, just to say, yeah, we have to penetrate the idea, which has been so much in people's minds, and that the party knows this and will know what to do. They've gone to the boundary of what they can do. There's limits, and in fact, they're not anymore. If we think of the kind of flying geese paradigm, China's not at the bottom of that anymore. And so there's an interesting moment where there's an opportunity to have this discussion. China, of course, with its Made in China 2025 initiative, is calling for a transformation on its own. How that relates to its efforts through Belt and Road to secure the continental pathway to securing limited resources has to be a global discussion. And there's where, at the UN, for example, the China expert was a junior person who was following a very strict protocol. She said only what she was supposed to say and didn't answer questions. That's China today. That's got to change. How will that change? I'm not sure, but I do know that we have to try to engage more and more people from that part of the world and open that up, because they're in the same planet that we are.
Great, thanks, Gary. And Bob?
So with regard to China, I think the thing we need to do vis-a-vis China is learn from China. When China, and to a lesser extent Japan and South Korea, were demonstrating that there was a superior approach to development that was completely at odds with the neoliberal model, the World Bank and the IMF just looked the other way and pretended not to see anything.
Yeah.
And when I say learn from China, we just published an issue called the Green New Deal, which calls for a huge amount of public investment as well as decarbonizing. And some of that is going to fly in the face, as Adam Burke wrote in our issue, of the current rules of trade. But that's a more constructive kind of dispute with China than the one that we currently have. That is, if we target high-speed rail for development in the United States and want to build some of those rail cars here rather than going offshore and purchasing them, that's an okay thing to do. We need to give ourselves permission to do that. China is now sufficiently mature that a lot of the demand can go back into the Chinese domestic economy. It doesn't all have to be export-led, and that's happening anyway. So I think that's a kinder, gentler kind of competition than the one that we have now, and less likely to stimulate the kind of animosity that we've had. Unity on the left. Well, the old joke is, what's the definition of two leftists in a room? A split. And having observed the Occupy movement close up, I will say to you, anarchism doesn't do it. And so the left is always like this. There's a lot of yeasty argument bubbling up. On the whole, it's a good thing. At some point, if you're going to govern, you have to figure out on what basis you're going to govern. On the question of imperialism and neoliberalism, Keynes was a creature of the late 19th century. And when he came of age, Britain was an imperialist power. And that was just the reality of the world in which he lived. And I think the current counterpart of the wreckage that was imposed on developing countries by Western imperialism a century ago is the wreckage being imposed by neoliberalism. And that's how we fight neocolonialism, is by fighting neoliberalism.
Okay, well, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I'm delighted that we had the opportunity to launch Jim's book into the world, and I think the timing of the book is really important. The term socialism has been kind of neutered and re-legitimized, surprisingly, in the U.S., which I think provides a real opportunity for further attention to Jim's book. and many of the policies that really at the heart of Keynes's radical insights and Jim's interpretation of them, namely capital controls and industrial policy, are also policies which are being newly re-legitimized and discussed, which I think also provides an important platform for Jim's book. We're going to take a 5-minute break and come back and hear from Jamie. Thank you.
Where's your dedication, brother?
Yeah, I depend on
Oh, you're very welcome.
Marvelous.
Congratulations. Good to see you. How are you?
Thank you, sir.
How
How are you? See you. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Going to start in 1 minute. Yeah, it's really fun.
That was great.
Yeah.
That was really, really
Okay, we're really truly going to start in 1 minute.
G20 eminent persons. Statement about something to do with democracy and capitalism.
No, that's a.
Thank you. Oh, no, you're so sweet. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Exactly. I'm sorry. No, I was just sitting there so I could discipline the boys. Now that's not my job. Now you're going to be free. Now you're going to be free. I guess what we were Jamie is right. Well, Jamie is, this next session is Jamie, alone, right, and then we're on group. Yeah, so if I say this, yes, that would be great, and then I'll be quick, we get, okay, that's good, all right.
Okay, we're starting. Could everyone please sit down? Okay, so our next session, we have the great opportunity to hear from our friend, colleague, leading thinker, all-around great guy, James Galbraith, who, as I already noted, was the one who came up with the idea for this conference in the first place. Jamie's title is, for his talk, is Pragmatism and Ideology and the Legacy of John Maynard Keynes. And before I give him the mic here, I want to just mention a couple points about Jamie. As he himself already said, he is the Lloyd Benston Chair in Government and Business Relations at the LBJ School. He is, by any measure, an eminent economist who has been producing outstanding work for decades. I myself first met Jamie. He may not even remember this, but I did talk to your wife about it a couple weeks ago in Austin. I first met Jamie. I don't even remember why, but I showed up at his office when he was the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, and I don't know what I was doing there, but I was there. So, and he had a big wooden desk in a fancy office, and so I don't know how we got going, but we started talking about systemic instability in finance. This was 1983, maybe. We talked about Hyman Minsky. We talked about techniques for controlling finance, new regulatory approaches such as asset reserve requirements. And the reason I had gotten into it was because in the 70s, I guess under Wright-Patman, there was a publication that explored these alternative regulatory approaches, and I was thinking about how to revive them. And then there was Jamie sitting there. So I said, wow. We were saying we're both thinking in similar lines, but maybe there's nobody else that we know that is doing it. And I was doing it just as a new assistant professor at the time, but Jamie was the chair of the committee. That kind of led into this work that Jamie was involved in, and Gary Dimsky and Jerry and Tom Schlesinger and Jane DeRista on this volume that we did with EPI on regulating finance. So that's how I first got to know Jamie. Of course, I've followed his work ever since, because if you're serious about doing economics in a good way, you need to follow Jamie's work. I'm not the only one that follows his work. So between 1993 and 97, he was the chief technical advisor to China's State Planning Commission. He's author of many important books. Only the two most recent, both books in 2016. One is Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know. And the other one is the one I briefly referred to in my own remarks. Welcome to the Poison Chalice, Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe. And I guess since the book came out in 2016 and it's now 2019, I can publicly reveal for the first time that I was one of the reviewers of the book for Yale University Press. And I just wrote them back and said, of course you must publish this book. Do not change one word. This is a great book, and it is a great book. It is a brilliant mixture, because Jamie, as was in China, he was a top advisor to the government at the time, dealing with the onslaught of austerity policies and what exactly Greece should do under the new Syriza government. So the book combines analytic economics with memoir and reflections on politics. It is quintessential Jamie Galbraith. I strongly recommend it, as equally strongly as I recommended it to Yale University Press at the time. Anyway, Jamie Galbraith.
Bob, thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. I shall try to give a serious talk, notwithstanding that I can't remember a morning that has made me happier than listening to the first panel just now. Keynes Against Capitalism is a compact and contentious, but perhaps not wholly apt title for Jim Crotty's wonderful book. It occurred to me that it might possibly have instead be called Keynes for the 21st Century. And if it had been printed with the word Keynes in bright red on a white background, millions of copies would fly off the shelves. The opening pages of The Economic Consequences of the Peace, with their invocation of the glorious period in English life that ended in August 1914, make it clear enough that Keynes did not oppose the functioning capitalism, unequal though it was, that animated the second half of the 19th century, caging the Malthusian demon and giving rise to a prosperous and largely contented middle class, with the acquiescence of a working class whose living standards rose just enough to give the lie to the classical economists and their iron law of wages. No. The problem was, rather, that this age rested on a certain set of illusions, an unstable psychological foundation, the double bluff, which the war had shattered and which could not be repaired. So something had to be done. Crotty proposes, explains, and documents with astonishing verve and precision that Keynes was not nostalgic, but forward-looking. He proposed not to restore capitalism, but to replace it. And with what? Keynes was a liberal. To him, freedom was a paramount virtue. But the failure of the engine of investment and public provision mandated socialism, social control of the investment function. Combining these two, the ideal and the necessary, gives us what one might call the Hayekian oxymoron of liberal socialism, a vision which Crotty has taught us to identify with Keynes from now on. What is liberal socialism? It is a combination of ideological constructs, each with a specific meaning at the time that Keynes wrote, each freighted with particular political history. Liberal evokes the Enlightenment and commercial capitalism in the age of Victoria and Gladstone, a tradition of English political thought that I would associate with John Stuart Mill, genteel, high-minded, with unstated undercurrents of hierarchy, repression, and even violence. Socialism, on the other hand, was a revolutionary, transformative ideal associated with Jaurès, with the Fabians, with 1920s Vienna. This was almost before Lenin. It was long before Khrushchev's exposure of Stalin in 1956, decades before Mao took power in China. Keynes is therefore combining two noble ideals, which raises the question, was he trying to reconcile the irreconcilable? Or was he using the language of ideals, the language of ideology, to call for something that might not be quite liberal or quite socialist, but that might become practical reality? If one transposes liberal socialism into post-war economics, one gets an ideological answer to an ideological question. The post-war pseudo-Keynesians, mostly in North America, divided liberal and socialist into two halves. They called one micro and the other macro. And they invented the Christmas holiday to keep them apart. Micro became the domain of market freedom. Macro remained as the sphere of economic management. Christmas assured that one would be forgotten before the other was taken up. And so this kept the undergraduates who were subjected to this discipline in a state of at least, I wouldn't say psychological balance, but psychological survival. In this way, an obvious inconsistency was ducked for decades until gradually the macroeconomists died out and the condominium collapsed under a few light taps from Robert Lucas and the new classical school. This was not a bad thing, in my view. The rubble of a corrupt compromise must be cleared before we can build something better. What Crotty also brings out, and it's, in my view, the best part of the book, though the hardest to summarize, is that Keynes also left a legacy that is neither micro nor macro, neither fish nor fowl, which is what Franklin Roosevelt said of the Tennessee Valley Authority, but something that'll taste mighty good to the people of the Tennessee Valley. But practical policy based on the problems and needs of the moment. This legacy is institutional and pragmatic. It has lines of affinity and descent through Commons, John R. Commons, through my father, through Nicholas Caldor and Robert Eisner, through Jane DiResta and Ilene Grabel. It prefigures the ongoing merger of the post-Keynesians and the institutionalists, and the rise, I might add, of modern monetary theory, and perhaps also my own work on inequality, which is also an attempt to bring the separated halves of economic thought into a single consistent framework. It was all part, in my view, of the practical structure that now needs to be built. For example, the year 1924 was not, I believe, a depression year. Churchill, the return to gold, the crash and the collapse all lay ahead. It was, however, a year of deflation, of low profits, relatively high unemployment, low investment, and the export of capital to what we would now call emerging markets. Nice, sort of loaded and misleading phrase. The emerging markets are frequently submerging markets, but that detail is overlooked. Secular stagnation is perhaps the right phrase. Keynes called for, quote, the diversion of national savings from relatively barren foreign investment into state-encouraged constructive enterprises at home in a policy of, quote, endless experiments from which, quote, the true socialism of the future will emerge. Something which is a work in progress, right? The vision of it is not fixed. A book has been discussed on Britain's industrial future would follow in 1926, laying out, quote, an incredibly ambitious set of possible investment projects, that's Crotty, taking up 140 pages in total. All this is forgotten, or would be, but for Jim Crotty. the liberal program of 1929, we can conquer unemployment, and can Lloyd George do it? I've reprised that in a short essay recently entitled, Can Bernie Do It? Lay still further ahead and are scarcely more remembered, but this is not accidental. Though a liberal, Keynes was no starry-eyed zealot of antitrust. Quote, in modern conditions, he wrote, a tendency towards some degree of monopoly is inevitable and even quite often desirable in the interests of efficiency. And as for paying for things, for the investment program, he is categorical. Quote, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Quote, so once it's done, it's there. You can't take it away. Was there ever a place where these principles, endless experiment, incredibly ambitious public investment, capital controls, and a right-sizing policy for industries, not too big, not too small, was ever applied? Yes, I can think of several. One of them was right here in the United States by the New Deal. The New Deal built 1,000 airfields. It paved 600,000 miles of roads. My father in 1930 took a Model T from Cleveland, crossing from Canada, out to graduate school at Berkeley, and noted that from Lincoln, Nebraska to the California line, there was not a single paved road. It built 1 billion courthouses. Sorry, not 1 billion courthouses. Built courthouses in every county, planted 1 billion trees, rebuilt every rural school, electrified the South and the Southwest, dug the Lincoln Tunnel, built the Triborough Bridge, and the aircraft carrier Lexington. In doing so, it cut unemployment from the Depression levels, 25% or so in 1933, to below 10% by 1936, once you count in as employed the people who were working on the Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it got Roosevelt reelected with the votes of all but 2 states in 1936. The 2, I regret to say, being my sometime home state of Vermont and Kara Pavlik's home state of Maine. But both of us have been working diligently to make sure that that mistake does not happen again. It paved the way also for the greatest industrial mobilization in world history. Every aircraft that saw service during the Second World War was effectively designed in the 1930s. And this progress was reprised, and a great many things that are unfinished were advanced, if not completed, in the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, the last great New Dealer to serve as president, and whose legacy is part of the institution that we are present in this morning. Is there any other place that stands out as having been an example of process of endless experiment, continuing and changing reform? And I suggest there is, and it's already been mentioned, and that is modern China. A country that in 30 years has urbanized about 500 million people, that in a decade has laid down 20,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, with extensions now going out across Asia to Europe and even down across Indonesia to the Timor Gap. China is not liberal. It's not exactly socialist either, but it is the world's great example of investment-driven, state-supported, planned economic growth. It's the Keynesian state in this century. And how did it happen? Well, I think I could tell you if I could reveal a little hidden history of that, which is that during the time when I was working as chief technical advisor for macroeconomic reform for the State Planning Commission. To paraphrase John F. Kennedy in Paris, I was the man who accompanied Jane D'Arista to China, along with Bob Eisner. This was in 1995. Our agenda was to dissuade them from opening up the capital, lifting capital controls. They didn't lift them. And let me just gently submit that the rest is history, Jane. Meanwhile, ordo-liberal Europe suffers from the stagnation that is endemic to an economic confederacy caught in the grips of an ideology that is not functional, that is not experimental, that is not imaginative, but that is driven by an ideological framework. And in the United States, we are being cleaved in two with a false oligarchic financial technical prosperity on our coasts and a bitter decay in between, which shows up in the extraordinarily dramatic political divisions that have emerged in this country, which probably are as great as at any time in a century and a half. And meanwhile, the climate crisis looms over us. What is to be done? Endless experiment. A new policy of full employment driven by a grand strategy of planned investments aimed at making a successful transition to clean energy while preserving or improving, there's lots of things that can be improved, the general quality of life. Something which is driven by a vision that is hopeful and imaginative and that leads toward a better, not only a more sustainable, but actually a better country in which to live and world in which to live. For this, the financial demons, something that Bob and I talked about in 1983, must be yoked. The democratic process must be restored. The illusions of empire must be extinguished. And better security in health, in home, in retirement, provided for working people and for those who are unable to work. Do we have a name for this? Well, we do. It's called the Green New Deal. It's a project, a work in progress. The details remain to be developed in full, but it provides a framing for thinking about what we should be doing, how we should proceed in the spirit of Keynes, Jim Crotty, Jane D'Arista, Ilene Grabel, Gerald Epstein, to put ourselves on the job. So with that, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jamie. So you open to taking. We don't? Oh, okay. All right. Well, then we don't have time for that. Okay. The next panel. Let's see.
So sorry for the abrupt shift, but we're a little bit over time. Thank you, Jamie, very much for
That was great.
presentation. Now we have the final panel today, and Jane D'Arista, Ilene Grabel, and myself. So we'll just make a little shift here. Where do you want to?
You could sit on the end in this, if I may.
Okay.
Push a chair back, so let everybody else get seated first.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me, Jerry.
By the way, we will have time after this panel for general discussion, so please at that time, if you have questions for Jamie,
Okay.
please ask them then. So that will be an opportunity to ask any questions about this.
Second.
It's great. I meant to send you an email. I loved it. Sent it out to my classes right away.
Is this, you want it here?
sit on this, Carl, and we'll just put that over. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
So the title of this panel is Reflections on Global Financial Instability and Financial Architecture. We have three presenters, Jane Darista, Ilene Grabel, and myself, Gerald Epstein. We're going to be presenting on three books. Jane's book is first, and it's a wonderful book, which I've read and learned from and assigned to my students. It's called All Fall Down. Jane Darista.
So, All Fall Down is a book that traces the institutional developments that contributed to the 20th financial crisis. Since I am an institutional economist, which means that I've spent an entire career as an endangered species and linked to another endangered species, which is the economic historian. And so this book melds those two issues together. It looks back for 50 years to find elements that developed over time that contributed to the crisis and have been overlooked. And it will go ahead, as I will try to make clear in this presentation, to contribute to utter insanity in financial markets, in the Keynesian meaning of that term, and elements that have not been dealt with, that have not been discussed. There are no plans for. We are looking at another financial crisis that will emerge out of some of these same elements, and no discussion and no path that is going forward to try to address the problems that were involved. So the main systemic change that occurred over this time is the shift, and so ignored, from a bank-based system to a market-based system with endless repercussions that affect both the financial sector and the real economy. So what I'm saying by that is the main activity in financial markets shifted from deposit taking and lending to trading. And trading, of course, dominates the market now. And so the proof of this problem is that we have now a bank system that accounts for about 25% of the value of all financial assets compared to 60% back in the 1960s. It's a major change. And we have come forward out of Dodd-Frank with a regulatory framework that remains unchanged. We have not taken account of that issue. So I'm going to outline quickly four of the main things that have happened over this period of time that have made this change occur. And then I'm going to talk especially about globalization and what that has meant as a result of these changes. The first change is, of course, the development of offshore markets. This incredible decision that markets would be free of regulatory and monetary constraints, and the Euro market, as we used to call it, the external markets, the offshore markets, whatever the name, are a laissez-faire advocate's dream come true. It is the absolute enshrinement, and we don't even discuss it, of laissez-faire, which now dominates our world, both financially and economically. So I want to talk about that and those implications, et cetera. But I want to move on and say that, the other important thing that occurred that is also not often recognized is the enactment of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. a very worthwhile piece of legislation which took into account the fact that major corporations were collapsing and the proposed promises for retirement were disappearing. The requirement of this act was, if you make a promise to give a pension, you must back it with assets. Well, not surprisingly, what did this do? It set off an enormous demand for securities, for tradable assets, and moved household savings out of banks and into the capital markets, where households have now become the shock absorber of financial instability. So the next one that would be important to note is the growth of contingency lending and its development and contribution to shadow banking. That began with the collapse of Penn Central and the Fed blessing the idea that banks would promise corporations that lost access to the market, commercial paper market, that they would make a loan to them. This then created a situation in which, if this is a bank, well, how do you class this contract? Well, you put it off balance sheet because it's not an asset or a liability until it's executed. So we began to get this off balance sheet thing, which just rolled right ahead, fed, of course, by the external market, by derivatives, by mortgage-backed securities, by all the securitization issues, et cetera, that came into play, and then eventually, not too far along the way, provided the means for banks to engage in, or the large institutions to engage in, proprietary trading, and therefore just unleashed what has become a totally speculative market, both nationally and internationally. So, the important thing about the external market, one more thing before I move back to that, is the concurrent development of what I call opaque markets, non-public markets, which is to say that you have these huge markets now, like for foreign exchange, which is 5 times the size of the aggregate of all global equity markets. And then you have the market of mortgage-backed securities, the derivatives markets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're non-public markets. There's no information on price or volume, et cetera, at the end of the day. So that in September of 2008, when panic was occurring across the entire financial system, you had the little Dow Jones report, the FTSE reports at the end of the day. This is how much the price was and what the volume was on something that had become totally meaningless in the face of this enormous panic that was going on. But it shows you the difference that we had in the past, public markets that serve the purpose. And when you don't, what you get is panic and frozen markets. So that's another point to put there. And the securitization, of course, contributed to that as well. And so the shadow banking was an issue that was in full play as early as the 1980s, with a lot of the off-balance sheet stuff coming out of the derivatives market, et cetera. But it of course also facilitated the proliferation of all those wonderful products that we have discussed endlessly about the 2007-8 crisis, the CDOs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we get into a situation in which we are moving into a place where the export of deregulation from the external market had been taken over in the national markets. Now, one of the major things about the external market was that immediately the banks found the need to fund themselves from other financial institutions. In other words, funding became within the system itself. And therefore, interconnectedness, a major factor in the crisis, was developed as early as the failure of Franklin National Bank in 1975, when the Fed had to take over Franklin's portfolio of foreign exchange because it was going to bring down the financial system if they did not do so. Did we learn from that? That was a long time ago, but there was no learning from it. No. And so what we had going forward is a situation in which we have the continued interconnection, the funding through the repo market, and the.
Is this on?
Are you hearing me?
Okay.
Okay. And the growth of the market in the United States, especially at the end of the 90s and through the middle and up to the crisis, for repurchase agreements, which we like Topsy. And so what you have here is a system for the creation of debt within the financial sector, which became historically high and, of course, very frightening as a repercussion. What you also had as a result of interconnectedness was what really happened with the financial crisis is that the financial sector posed a ruin on the financial sector, a run on the financial sector. It was not the ordinary customer. It was actually what happened within the markets themselves. So now I would like to talk about the globalization issue. And it comes out, of course, of the external market, its creation at the end of the 1960s, and what it has done in so many different areas. First of all, it moved the movements, the influence, say, over exchange rates from trade to capital flows. And so the capital sheet, balance sheet of any economy became the most important focus over time that was going on. It was a situation also in which there were a new paradigm in the global economy was created because you created a key currency system based on the dollar, and that emerged over time. So in a key currency situation, you have the backing is the confidence in the economic growth of the key currency country, and thus the appreciation of its assets, those assets denominated in its currency, and its ability to service its external debt. So the trade effects of that system became very apparent quite early. Other countries must run a trade surplus in order to acquire the currency that they need to transact in the global economy, and this encouraged and perpetuated for over this period of time the need for export-led growth in every country, of course, except the key currency country, which, on the contrary, became the buyer of last resort in the economy. And so I think I have this quote from Nicholas Caldor that I want to read you of what he saw that was going to be the outcome of this. In 1971, he wrote a series of 3 articles for the London Times, which were quite passionate to read. They're quite wonderful articles. And he was saying, in a sense, that this was going to result in a very terrible outcome for the United States in particular, and for the world. But here's what he said about the key currency country. It will involve transforming a nation of creative producers into a community of rentiers, increasingly living on others, seeking gratification in ever more useless consumption, with all of the debilitating effects of the bread and circuses of imperial Rome. Now, he said that in 71. Well, that's where we are. That's what we have. And it's a perfect description, how prescient of him and how appropriately stated as an outcome of a key currency system. So now we have a threat to this system, and that threat is debt. How do we get so much debt? Well, there are many different ways, but to choose one, it's to talk about the developing countries and or emerging markets, or however we wish to call them. They had, after the Asian crisis, decided that they had to self-insure by amassing foreign exchange reserves. Now, those reserves are held on their balance sheets as backing for domestic credit. They then get invested in the key currency country and expand credit there. And then they are also invested in the external market and expand credit there. And they have become, as it were, the creditors to the international banks in that market. In other words, they have led to the funding, they've contributed to the funding against which they were trying to guard against, in other words, the capital flows. And so you have this incredible increase in debt. Foreign exchange reserves of emerging market countries now constitute 24% of global GDP. This is not a small amount of money. Therefore, if you have a situation in which the value of the reserves they hold falls because of whatever reason, there is a loss of confidence in the growth of the U.S. economy, you will have a situation in which those economies will contract enormously and spread that contraction globally. What then I would also like to say is about the United States itself. We have, of course, lived beyond our means. We have, throughout the 90s and up to the crisis in 2008, the amount of foreign savings that has come in to the U.S. economy has averaged about 15% a year. In other words, more money than we produce ourselves. But what? 50 GDP. Pardon me. And so then the outcome is that we can live beyond our means. But we are amassing debt both to the international sector. By 2016, 53% of U.S. GDP was owed to foreigners. In other words, as Roosevelt said famously, we owe it to ourselves is no longer true. And so we are in a situation where we look at the deficit of the Treasury and we ignore that as that money came in and expanded credit, it expanded it for every sector in the U.S. economy, and that U.S. debt grew to 350% of GDP, which means constraint. How do you service it? What is the future? And so my book goes to address a lot of these other issues. It also has lots of plans in it, but I will leave you to read the book to see them. Mostly those plans deal with just the conversation we've had this morning, which is how do we get the public sector influence back into governing the economy? Because what I am seeing here in the financial sector is a form of insanity. And I haven't even talked about capital, the implosion of capital, the insanity for an institutionalist of saying, for an institutionalist, the capital requirement is the emperor without clothes. It is the absolute epicenter of implosion. And there is no way that the private sector can ever create that kind of capital in a downturn if you don't get the public sector back into the situation. The next financial crisis will come. We don't know when, and we don't know what the trigger. There are so many out there that could happen, but we do know we don't know how it's going to be handled. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. You whetted our appetite. Now, everybody go out and buy our book. We have pamphlets outside. You can get a discount by taking one of the pamphlets and using the code there to buy All Fall Down. Our next speaker is Ilene Grabel at the Joseph Corpel School of International Studies, University of Denver. She's going to talk about her award-winning book. It's won many awards, When Things Don't Fall Apart, Global Governance and developmental finance in an age of productive incoherence. And we're reading this book next week in my class. So we have students here from there, and you're giving them the Cliff Notes today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I just want to very quickly thank Jamie for cooking up this idea and for hosting us, the LBJ Center, and Bob Weinstein for bringing this event to life. And thank you all for coming. Let me just take of time. I'd like to introduce my book by stating an obvious point, and that is that the East Asian financial crisis of the 1990s and the global crisis focused a great deal of attention on the failings of the global financial architecture. Now, this recognition about the failings of the global architecture catalyzed development of many ambitious proposals for architectural reform. The failure of the reform agendas after these and previous crises has led most observers to emphasize continuity in financial governance. And in the book, I call this the continuity thesis. Now, what I argue in the book is that the continuity thesis fundamentally misses the point. And what I show is that the Asian and especially the global crisis catalyzed disparate and disconnected innovations across several dimensions of global financial governance. And I argue further that these discontinuities matter, particularly from the perspective of developing countries. But just to be clear, so that I'm not misunderstood, this is not to say that the global crisis has occasioned an abrupt regime shift from one regime of global financial governance to another. It surely hasn't. But what I also argue, and this is really the key point for me, is that a chief problem with the way that most social scientists understand change is such that systemic regime displacement is taken as the only and true test of change. The Bretton Woods and the neoliberal revolutions are the kind of paradigmatic examples of regime displacement. And my chief goal in the book is to move beyond these simplistic notions of change and to defend what I call the productive incoherence thesis. My argument is that the changes that we confront are best understood as ad hoc, fragmented, and evolutionary in nature. And it's in this sense that global financial governance, taken as a whole, is today incoherent. And the result so far has been the emergence of an increasingly dense, pluripolar set of fledgling institutions of financial governance and a diversity of institutional and policy practices that don't cohere around a grand vision. And I advance three claims in the book. The first is a positive claim. The positive claim is that the Asian and especially the global crisis occasioned meaningful, though ad hoc, partial, messy, and experimental discontinuities in several dimensions of global financial governance of particular salience to developing countries. However, again, I'll just note that the empirical story that I tell is not one of wall-to-wall change. The second claim that I make is normative and controversial, and that is that emergent incoherence is on balance productive rather than debilitating. And just to anticipate something to which I'll return later, I want to be clear that though I'm encouraged by emergent incoherence, this does not imply that it's without risk. The third claim that I advance is that emergent productive incoherence can be most fully understood within what I call a Hirschmanian mindset, by which I mean an understanding of change informed by Albert Hirschman's epistemic and theoretical commitments. Now, the alternative vision of change that I advance in the book, and which reflects key commitments that mark Hirschman's work, turn our attention away from epical ruptures that occur infrequently in historical terms, but which tend to receive disproportionate amount of attention from scholars. Instead, a kind of Hirschmanian approach turns our attention toward more prevalent but prosaic, small-scale and evolutionary changes. In the Hirschmanian view, development is understood as a process of social learning and experimentation. Critically important as well is the role of problem solving in response to previously unforeseen or underestimated challenges. This is Hirschman's conception of the hiding hand. Other aspects of Hirschman's work that are pregnant with insights from my own work include his commitment to what he called possibilism and his bias for hope. Central to Hirschman's possibilism is his humility and his epistemic commitment to fundamental uncertainty, and certainly the embrace of uncertainty connects Hirschman very directly to the work of Keynes, Crotty, Frank Knight, and G.L.S. Shackle. Hirschman's well-known work on exit, voice, and loyalty examines the circumstances under which actors engage or disengage with institutions that don't serve their needs. And so in the book, after I discuss in some depth the most salient aspects of Hirschman's thinking for my own thinking, I explore the contradictory effects of the East Asian financial crisis, which I argue lay the groundwork for the uneven evolutionary changes associated with the global crisis and its aftermath. And in the book's 4 empirical chapters, I examine areas of financial governance across which we find a complex mix of continuities, discontinuities, and ambiguities. One case that I examine is the case of the IMF. There's a great deal of evidence on the continuity side of the ledger when we consider the IMF. For example, the crisis restored the IMF's coffers and its central role in crisis management. The IMF's assistance packages followed a well-rehearsed counter-cyclical script. Developing countries secured only very modest voting share increases. The US and Europe exercised disproportionate influence at the institution, and David Malpass's appointment to the World Bank is certainly another tick on the side of continuity with outdated leadership selection practices. Now, the Trump appointees to the Bretton Woods institutions may bring about an important discontinuity, which is reduced US engagement with and influence at the Bretton Woods institutions, something that's already begun to happen. And this may, in fact, be the only silver lining of the Trump administration, that is to say, its disengagement with the Bretton Woods institutions. However, I'll note, even before the Trump appointees came on the scene, there were important discontinuities emerging at the Bretton Woods institutions. For instance, developing countries twice took the unprecedented step of lending to rather than borrowing from the IMF. That was in 2009 and 2012. The institution's client base largely shifted to the European periphery and away from the developing world. And there was evidence of tension between the IMF and Eurozone authorities in several respects during the global crisis. In addition, the crisis opened channels for several countries, particularly China, to increase its informal influence at the institution. Relatedly, the crisis seems to have ushered in a new norm that a deputy managing director position is given to an official from the People's Bank of China. Now, productive incoherence in global financial governance is evidenced in other realms as well. Another realm relates to innovations in financial governance in the global South and the global East. This is apparent both in institutions that provide counter-cyclical support and development banks that provide long-term loans. For institutions whose existence predates the global crisis, we find expansion in the scale of activity, the geographic reach, and the introduction of novel mechanisms. Examples of institutions that expanded their capacity include the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization of the ASEAN +3, the Latin American Reserve Fund, the Arab Monetary Fund, and the Development Bank of Latin America. We also find institutional hybridization as reflected in decisions by several regional and national development banks to take on a new role of providing counter-cyclical finance. Examples are found in Brazil's Bank of Economic and Social Development, the China Development Bank, and the Development Bank of Latin America. We, of course, also find institutions that have been created during the crisis. Examples include the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development of the Eurasian Economic Community, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement and the New Development Bank of the BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the other funds that China has created to support the Belt and Road Initiative. Many of these institutions have signed cooperation agreements with one another, and I think notably, in contrast to its hostility to the Asian Monetary Fund proposal that was advanced by the Japanese government in the late 1990s, the IMF has been encouraging the expansion of and connections among these institutions, and indeed the IMF is involved in discussions of rules of engagement with these institutions and is in the process of developing an instrument to provide backstop financing financing to these institutions. And so that's another dimension of the productive incoherence that I address. The third dimension that I'll address empirically concerns the matter of capital controls. Capital controls fell out of favor in the 1970s and remained so during the long neoliberal era. During the global crisis, a wide range of developing countries used a variety of controls on capital inflows and outflows, and capital controls have effectively been rebranded as a legitimate policy tool by the credit rating agencies, the conservative heart of the economics profession, and by the IMF, which prescribed them to borrowing and non-borrowing countries during the crisis. And so stepping away from the empirics of the book, I'd say that the institutional aperture and the innovations that I discuss in the book may not persuade those of you who are committed to what I see as romantic narratives of systemic change. I think that's unfortunate. From my perspective, recent crises might be best understood as crucial turning points in a contested, uneven, long-term process of pragmatic adjustment in financial governance. A non-coherent system is better able to protect space for diversity and experimentation. And I think after decades of stultifying neoliberal coherence, the space provided by incoherence is a welcome deviation. In my view, one advantage of incoherence and pluripolarity is that it provides developing countries with a degree of insulation from a noxious policy environment on the global level, since after all, an unintended consequence of a coherent, streamlined, centralized global financial architecture is that any structural weaknesses are magnified and negative spillover effects are more powerfully and directly transmitted across countries and regions. I think incoherence presents other opportunities as well. A more densely populated institutional landscape expands opportunities for problem solving, experimentation, learning by doing and learning from others, the creation of new networks, partnerships, and coalitions, and provides opportunities for forum shopping that can be of particular benefit to smaller countries. Emergent productive redundancy also increases the availability of long-term loans and resources for crisis support that can fill gaps in the global financial architecture. Finally, there's evidence that actors at the Bretton Woods institutions are feeling the pressure from competitive financial pluralism. And so that's the upside, and I claim obviously that it's substantial, but we also have to recognize that incoherence, redundancy, and emergent pluripolarity entail important risks. And indeed, I turn to the destructive aspects of incoherence in the book's concluding chapter. One risk of incoherence that I note is innocent but damaging spillovers associated with decisions by policymakers in one country to experiment and pragmatically adjust to challenges and risks. Another risk of incoherence may be associated with explicit beggar thy neighbor policies, wherein one country engages in innovations designed to monopolize or offload risks and harms onto others. A final risk of incoherence is the systemic risk that may emanate from the disconnected decisions of private and public actors. And certainly uncertainties about where crisis responsibility lies and conflict around rules of engagement and leadership can deepen instability during crisis. And experience in this regard precisely, I think, drives the IMF's recent engagement with developing country financial institutions. Now, none of the risks that I've mentioned are unique to the emerging Hirschmanian world, but neither are they resolved by it. Notwithstanding these risks, I think it's naive to think that we should be nostalgic for the coherent days of the neoliberal era and the coherence of the monolithic governance architecture that underpinned it. After all, would it be better for developing countries if the Trump administration had at its disposal a streamlined Bretton Woods architecture through which it could leverage its power to constrain policy autonomy, frustrate the SDGs, and otherwise wreak havoc and play out petty grudges? And so, as damaging damaging as the Trump's impact has been so far, and the worst may yet to come, I think it's at least arguable that he lacks the levers under the evolving global financial architecture to impose his vision on others, at least with the same degree of success enjoyed by the champions of neoliberalism. So that a Trump in, say, the late 1990s, at the height of neoliberalism's coherence and power, would arguably have posed a deeper threat to developing countries. And I think, moreover, it's implausible to think that the aspirations of developing countries are in any way served by a return to the institutionally sparse, coherent and centripetal financial and intellectual architecture of the last decades. And so here, just to kind of wrap up, I think it's best that we consider the present period as a kind of interregnum between an era dominated by a dysfunctional Bretton Woods monoculture and something else, the parameters of which are as yet unknown and unknowable, to return to a Keynesian theme of the day. The evolving landscape is not likely to meld into a new, coherent global financial architecture that resembles the orderliness of the pre-global financial crisis world, not least because the array of China-led institutions is complementing, competing, radically reshaping, and above all, transforming the Bretton Woods landscape, where the line between advanced economy lending and developing country borrowing used to be drawn. The vacuum that's been created by the US's rejection of multilateralism suggests that there'll be greater space and more urgent need for China and others to step into the void. And this, of course, presents opportunities. And we have to be honest, it also presents real risks for developing countries, for US power, and for the shape of multilateralism. Engineers understand the need for redundancy when they design safety systems to ensure that they do well when placed under intense stress. I think that the increasingly dense and networked global financial architecture is prudent in the same way, even if it's by no means adequate in its current form, to maintain stability during the next crisis, as Jay noted, the timing of which is uncertain, though its eventuality is not. Nothing I've said should be taken to suggest that I think things won't fall apart. Indeed, they can and always will. The question for me is, when they do, will a messier, pluripolar, Hirschmanian global financial architecture be better situated to respond to developing countries in a world in which the Trump administration is unlikely to have an appetite to allow the Bretton Woods institutions to perform their traditional roles? Certainly, present conditions suggest that we'll know the answer to that question sooner rather than later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll call myself.
Oh, yes, and I'm going to. Yes, okay. Do you want a 5-minute warning, Jim? I hope I stayed on time. Okay.
So I was just trying to extort some more time, but she said niet.
That's what happens when your former dissertation advisor is up at the podium.
So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks again to Jamie and everybody involved in organizing this conference. Today I'm going to be talking about my book, The Political Economy of Central Banking. Oh yeah, there it is. The Contested Control and the Power of Finance. And it's a group of selected essays that I've written over the years on the political economy of central banking. Today I'll start my talk with using the background of the title of this conference, The Shadow of the Great Financial Crisis. The Great Financial Crisis of 2007, 2008, like the Great Depression of the 1930s, focused America's public attention and ire, not just on Wall Street, but also on the Federal Reserve. In normal times, in fact, the Fed operates kind of under the radar, generating intense interest from investors who think about every word that the chair of the Fed might say, but mostly yawns from everybody else. But at times of financial crisis, piercing scrutiny and conflict breaks out over the Fed's policy. Indeed, at times like that, more than this policy or that policy is up for grabs, the very raison d'etre of the Federal Reserve comes under contest. The Fed's whole institutional structure is sometimes attacked. People ask the question, why did the Fed let the economy crash? Why did it raise interest rates so high? Why did it bail out Wall Street while leaving Main Street high and dry? Who benefits from the Fed's policies? Who really pulls the strings there? Do we even need a Federal Reserve? Perhaps surprisingly, until fairly recently, these questions of why and who benefits and who pulls the strings were mostly ignored by economists and political scientists, even though the public periodically demanded to know the answers. For decades after the Second World War, most economists simply assumed the answers. The Federal Reserve, they said, was operating in the public interest. Standard theory implicitly claimed that trained technocrats at the Fed were trying to make optimal policy for the economy and for everyone in it. If they failed to do so, it was not out of malice or because they were trying to do something else. It was simply because they made a mistake. But as Jane DiRista and William Greider brilliantly argued in their crucial books more than 3 decades ago, this benign intellectual consensus is something new. Rather, in the late 19th century, prior to the founding of the Fed, and all the way up to the time of the New Deal scrutiny and critical analysis of the plans for a central bank, and then of the Federal Reserve itself, were front and center in American politics. As Greider reminds us, this is the money question, the issue of who controls the financial system and who wins and who loses as a result. This has been central to American politics and indeed politics in many parts of the world for decades, if not centuries. In the United States, as in other places, workers and especially farmers are highly dependent on credit to finance their agriculture. We're intensely interested in the factors affecting the cost and availability of credit. These questions include the monetary standard, where we have the gold standard, silver standard, a paper money standard, or now we have electronic standards. As a result, when the question of creating the Federal Reserve came up in 1913, US farmers and workers and intellectuals naturally raised these same issues. What is the central bank going to do and in whose interest? For their part, the bankers too were always very interested in these distributional and power issues. We talked about power this morning. They wanted to make sure that they, the bankers, and they alone held on tight to the monetary spigot so that high and unexpected inflation would not erode their profits and wealth. William Jennings Bryan's famous anti-banker speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention against the gold standard, in which he explained, "You will not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," is one of the more memorable manifestations of this money question and this conflict. But mainstream economics of the 1950s through the 2000s, the neo-Keynesian synthesis that we've been criticizing this morning, would have none of this. Central banks, according to this perspective, are the guardians of the national interest. Class conflict has nothing to do with it. I should note that, of course, this is deeply ironic, as we've heard this morning throughout. For John Maynard Keynes, the supposed inspiration of neo-Keynesian macroeconomics, he himself was acutely aware of the class nature of the Bank of England's policy, the central bank's policy generally. And he, as Jim Crotty reminds us, he strenuously fought against it. Yet despite this lack of attention to the role of class conflict in central banking, there was one element of conflict that mainstream economists highlighted: the perceived danger that politicians and government officials would try to capture control of the central bank to pursue their own short-term or even corrupt goals. Although this concern did not lead to deep analysis by economists about the political economy of this problem, it did lead to one simple recipe: keep central banks, quote unquote, independent from politics. Central bank independence became the mantra of mainstream economists as a necessary step to make sure that neutral central bank technicians would operate in the public interest. But what the term central bank independence really means, and the ambiguities and complexities involved in the concept, were mostly left undiscussed. A first major post-war crack in this view came in 1979, when newly appointed Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker jacked up interest rates into the double digits in an attempt to slay inflation. A major recession followed, farm foreclosures skyrocketed, families lost their houses, factories closed. Protests against Volcker and the Fed spread, and for the first time in decades, the money question came to the fore. William Greider's book, The Secrets of the Temple, chronicling and explaining the historical roots of this event, became a bestseller. Figure that, a book on the Federal Reserve becoming a bestseller. I can only envy that with my book. Tom Schlesinger, who's in the audience, traveled around the land as director of Financial Markets Center, trying to bring to economists and activists and anybody who listens attention of what the Fed was doing and trying to get us to understand why it was doing it. My essays, written over the span of almost 40 years and collected here, were initially motivated by my attempts to understand the forces driving Paul Volcker's monetary policy and to frame and answer the money question about the Federal Reserve first, and then later other central banks around the world. Many of these essays written in this book are written with co-authors who I thank collectively, since I don't have time to name them all, there's so many of them here, but the very talented individuals, economists, who contributed to this work. Early on, I and one of my earliest co-authors, Juliet Schor, developed what we called a contested terrain approach to understanding central bank policy. We came to understand that central banks, like other government institutions, are a battleground for control fought by different economic, social, and political forces, and yes, classes. The victors of this battle are not always the same. They depend on the constellation of political forces, historical accidents, institutions, and the evolution of the economy at different times and places. The history of the Federal Reserve illustrates this point. At its inception in 1913, the Fed was dominated by major banks in large cities like Chicago and especially New York. This domination, however, led to fateful monetary destructive choices that significantly contributed to the Great Depression. As a result, the Roosevelt administration reformed the structure of the Fed to reduce direct control by the banks and enhance the control of the government. With the outbreak of World War II and the needs of war finance, the Fed became under the control of the Treasury and kept interest rates relatively low throughout the duration of the war. The Fed and the bankers didn't like this, and after the war, they fought a tough political battle in order to get their independence with the Treasury Federal Reserve Accord that Jane Durista wrote beautifully about and that I learned so much from in writing our piece about that. This led to finance dominance of the Federal Reserve once again in this contested terrain. And this finance dominance has led to the draconian monetary policy of the Volcker period, and likewise contributed to the financial deregulation that followed this period and led to the great financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And this economic crisis and the failure of the Obama administration's banker-friendly bailout policies, in turn, have contributed to the election and power of Donald Trump. This brief history of the political economy of the Federal Reserve helps to explain the title of the book. The Political Economy of Central Banking, Contested Control and the Power of Finance. The central bank is a contested terrain, but the contest is not held on a level playing field. For a number of important and structural institutional reasons elucidated in the volume, finance has great advantages in this context and generally dominates in central banks like the United States. Finance is often able to play this game because of the large potential costs and benefits they can get from the central bank. In turn, the central bank needs the bankers. They need them to act as channels through which they make their policy. And importantly, they need the bankers for political support when they come under attack. So the central bank has the tools and the interests and a willing constituency that they can use carrots and sticks to create an I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine symbiosis between finance and the central bank. Now, this is a very big book. It's very long. It's written over 40 years, but you can understand the key idea in the book just from the cover. I engaged a very talented local artist, Alice Briggs, to do this cover. And what you see here, of course, is the Federal Reserve. And here we have former chairs of the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Jerome Powell. And what do we have down here is we have the bankers, and they're getting paid off, bailed out by the Federal Reserve. Now, my publisher wouldn't let me put the real names of these banks on the shield because they didn't want to get sued. But these are the shields that the bankers are holding to protect the Fed from the public. And I'll let you guess who the shields represent. Here we have Citi. Well, that's obvious. It's CTY. They wouldn't let me spell it CITI. Okay, so that's Citibank. So this, now it's getting harder. JME. Any idea who that is?
JP Morgan Chase.
Yes, JV Diamond, JV Morgan Chase. That's Jamie Diamond. How about VS?
Vikram.
Yeah, that could be it, but I thought of Vampire Squid, Goldman Sachs. And then we have TBTF, too big to fail. Down here we have Bernie Sanders. No more bailouts. We have the very important activist group Fed Up, saying Fed Up. And here we have Janet Yellen saying, "Let me back in." So there you have the whole book. So I have how much time left?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So the point is, this idea of central bank independence is a misleading concept because the central bank is not independent. It is totally dependent on finance. It's dependent on banks and it's dependent on finance for political support. And right now, as it's being attacked by Donald Trump and others, it's more dependent on the banks than ever. If you read the papers and notice what happened was Trump was attacking the Fed, you had the financial institutions coming to the fore and saying, no, Federal Reserve independence is so important and so forth. And what are the financial institutions getting in exchange? They're getting a lot of help from the Fed in undermining the Dodd-Frank Act, as Lisa Donner from Americans Financial Reform can testify. In my one remaining minute, do I have one remaining minute? The question is, well, what do we do about this? As a counter to this, idea of central bank independence, what we really need is more central bank democracy. We're now in a situation when more than ever, we need the central bank to carry out a broader, help carry out a broader agenda of described by Keynes and described this morning to restructure our economy. We need the central bank rather than taking away the punch bowl just when the party's getting going. We need the central bank to help provide the punch bowl for appropriate restructuring of our economy, especially in the area of the Green New Deal and the transition to a fossil-free economy. To do that, we need to have a central bank that's more integrated into the governance structure of our economy. It has to be more democratically organized, more democratically structured. And there are a number of different ways we can do this. Tom Schlesinger has written a lot of good work on describing these different ways. Let me just, in my last 30 seconds, name one. This one is designed to avoid the control by corrupt cronies like Donald Trump over the central bank while we're democratizing it. And it suggests that we use the regional system of the Federal Reserve that we have in this country, the regional reserve banks, to give them more authority, more power to help finance regional activities around the Green New Deal, around infrastructure investment and so forth. And that the regional boards of the Federal Reserve Banks be democratized so that citizens, community members, labor unions and so forth play a much bigger role on these boards, and the bankers play a much lower role. I'm building on this as an idea that was developed in a great article by Bob Poland. This is just one step that I think is absolutely necessary to get the Federal Reserve to play a more integrated and cooperative role with this transition that we need, and to make sure it does so in a more democratic fashion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry. Our next speaker is Robert Wade, who is going to comment on the three books. And just while Robert's making his way up here, I'll just say that I know Robert is someone who is extremely well known to all of us here. He is a professor at the London School of Economics, and I've always thought of him as a kind of Shakespearean figure in that he's written so much seminal work. It's hard to believe that he's just one person. We know his work on the World Bank, developmental states, the political economy of East Asia, trade, political economy of water management systems, and more recently, inequality. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, I'm well aware that I am all that stands between you and lunch. So I'm going to thank everybody who needs to be thanked and go straight on. And I am actually not going to spend a lot of time talking about the three books. That would be absolutely impossible in 20 minutes. I'm under very strict time control. But I want to begin with Jerry's book about central banking, and read a very short quote from Sir Alan Budd. Sir Alan Budd was a very senior person in the British Treasury, then a senior advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And what he says in this quote is very much consistent with Jerry's larger argument about the relationship between monetary policy and class conflict. It's a remarkable confirmation of that relationship. So this is what he said. The Thatcher government never believed for a moment that monetarism was the correct way to bring down inflation. They did, however, see that this would be a very good way to raise unemployment. And raising unemployment was an extremely desirable way of reducing the strength of the working classes. This has allowed the capitalists to make high profits ever since. So that's a rather stunning confirmation. And I wanted to go on and say something about your chapter on the Volcker shock, and lead into the apparently totally unrelated story of how in 1987, the World Bank came to make a gestalt shift away from saying, we do development, somebody else takes care of the environment, especially national governments, to saying we do environmentally sustainable development. This was a very, very conflictful gestalt shift, with all the developing countries on the board of the World Bank opposing the World Bank from becoming engaged in environmental protection, and with the US being the main figure in pushing this change. So what's the connection between the Volcker shock and the World Bank's embrace of the agenda of environmental protection? So the shock happened, as you know, in 1979, and it plunged Latin American countries into debt default or something close to that. And when Jim Baker came in as US Treasury Secretary in the second Reagan administration, 1985, he was appalled by the dangers posed to the US financial system of the risk of a Latin American debt default. So his great plan was to shift the risks of a Latin American debt default away from the US economy onto the membership of the World Bank. The problem was that Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club, various other NGOs with very good access to the Congress, they were telling the US Congress that the World Bank was destroying the environment, especially in the Amazon, but not only in the Amazon. And so Baker recognized that the Congress was in no mood to approve a significant increase in US funding for the World Bank, not even the Republicans, although the Republicans did actually think that the World Bank was a socialist institution and we would be better off without it. But they kind of went on in line with the NGO pressure as well. And so Baker then was able to seize the opportunity of a new president being appointed. He appointed the president. It was Barbara Conable. And when Conable was announced as the new president, everybody said, Barbara who? Nobody had ever heard of Barbara Conable, and Conable himself had strongly resisted being appointed the president on grounds that he knew nothing about finance, he knew nothing about development, but Baker chose him because, and said that it was his national duty to accept, because Conable had been the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in Congress for a long time, and he knew all about how to get individual Congress men and women to change their mind. And so Conable, when he came in, announced a great big environmental reform in the World Bank, a big expansion of environmentalists, and meanwhile was lobbying Congress to approve the capital increase. And so that is what happened. So that's the connection between the Volcker shock plunging Latin America into debt default and the bank making this big switch towards environmental protection. The point being that Baker had no interest in environmental protection. It was only a means to an end. Okay, so I want to go on and not talk specifically about the other two books, but to just make some comments on things that have come up today. And the first one is about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And it kind of links up with what Jerry was just saying, that we progressives must think of more democratic control over the central bank. And I want to direct your attention to a remarkable recent book by Quinn Slobodian called The Globalists. And he traces the origin of neoliberal thinking, the neoliberal movement in Vienna in the 1920s with Hayek and others, William Rappard, and then moving to Geneva in the 1930s. And he brings out the point that for this whole movement, then joined by Milton Friedman and others, for this whole movement took as one of its main objectives to erect a firewall between democracies and capital markets. And the whole point was to find a set of rules which would ensure that democracies could not interfere with the rights, the freedom of the owners and managers of capital to move the capital wherever, from one sector to another, whatever the sector, and from one place to another, whatever the place. And for them, this was really almost objective number one. So they would be appalled by this idea that the central bank should be put under any sort of democratic control. It's striking that Hayek had this brilliant illumination, as he himself said, that a decentralized market system, a price system, produced more accurate information about the economy than any central planner could have. He said that he had this illumination at about the same time that Keynes was writing about the need for a board of national investment, for example. So it's striking that these two basic ideas came at roughly the same time. And I want to go on, secondly, to talk about Keynes's idea of the Board of National Investment, social control of the investment function, the need for real experts doing this work, as Gary in particular brought out. With reference to the case of Taiwan, Taiwan has been held up in not neoliberal circles, but just orthodox economic circles, that is non-heterodox circles, as an example of pretty much free market capitalism being successful on the back of small and medium enterprises. I did a lot of research in Taiwan, and I think that basic image is profoundly misleading. And one of the things I'm interested in is how that image got established. Because, I mean, how it got established, at least in the West, was because the Taiwan government brought in plane loads full of orthodox economists, like Ian Little is just one name that comes to mind. And they spent a couple of weeks in Taiwan. They went around talking to government agencies, and they looked at documents. And then they wrote papers assuring the world that Taiwan was a free market success story. And they really didn't have a clue about how it operated, but they were paid a lot of money, individually paid a lot of money, not as much as Frederick Mishkin was paid in order to affirm the stability of the Icelandic financial system in 2006. He was paid $135,000. He knew nothing about Iceland, and he just put his name on a paper written by a conservative Icelandic economist, $135,000. So Ian Little and co. weren't paid anything like that, but still their books, Reynes was another one, their essays became very influential. And one of the things that they ignored was that Taiwan throughout has had, I'm not quite sure about today, but certainly into the 1990s, had a huge public enterprise sector in the upstream parts, governing petrochemicals, chemicals, the metal system, and so on. All these enterprises up at the top were either state-owned or some of them were party-owned. Then it had a central planning agency, the Council for Economic Planning and Development. And then alongside of that, this was in 1983, when Taiwan was way down the rankings of per capita income. In 1983, Taiwan had an industrial technology research institute with a staff of 10,000 employees, 10,000. And it was then disaggregated into institutes underneath this umbrella, ITRI it was called. And so one of these institutes underneath ITRI was called ERSO, Electronics Research and Service Organization, with a staff of 700. And their job was to screen global technology frontiers and bring in technology into Taiwan, domesticate it, push it out into Taiwan firms, and make it very easy for new firms or existing firms to take on these innovations. So that's how Taiwan was able to kind of power up through the middle income trap. And so let me go on and just say something about how the World Bank managed to get this so wrong in its East Asia Miracle Study published in 1993. It just quickly summarize the background to this. So Japan came under very strong criticism from the very top. The Japanese Ministry of Finance came under very strong criticism from the very top of the World Bank, which said, you must stop, you, the government of Japan, must stop your directed credit, your concessional credit schemes in your aid programs in Southeast Asia, because we, the World Bank, know that directed credit never works. And the Ministry of Finance got very upset, in particular because the Ministry of Finance thought that its main contribution to the Japanese miracle had been directed finance. And it was very angry that MITI had got all the credit for the Japanese miracle and it had been just eclipsed. So it wanted the World Bank to affirm that directed credit could be very effective as part of a development or an industrial strategy. And so it was the number two country, the number two stakeholder in the World Bank at that time. And the Ministry of Finance put well over $1 million on the table to the World Bank to do this study. The World Bank was very reluctant to undertake a study of the whole of the East Asia region, but it was forced to. It had no alternative. And so these were the conclusions. It came to the conclusion, first of all, that industrial policy could not work and generally was not effective. That was the phrase they used. Secondly, directed credit could be effective. And you ask how these two things could go together, because directed credit is part of industrial policy. But they knew that Japan wanted that conclusion, that directed credit could be effective. And so to write the chapter on East Asian financial systems, they got Joe Stiglitz to do it, because they knew that he would be sympathetic to that idea of directed credit being effective. And they knew also, secondly, that he was in line for the Nobel Prize. And so they knew that when the drafts of this report went up through the approval hierarchy of the World Bank, the economists were not going to tackle Joe Stiglitz and tell Joe Stiglitz that he was wrong. So that's how that anomaly came. That is, that the bank said industrial policy doesn't work, but directed credit can be effective. And so, yeah, that's the, yes, sorry. And then the bottom line was that this is the quote, the critical factor, and was the critical factor, not a critical factor, for the success of East Asia was free trade, basically. That was the key message of that study. So this is all about the sort of what I call the underwear politics of the advancement of orthodox knowledge. You said, no, Bob Poland said at the beginning, you didn't like the, was it you? You didn't like the term, yes, that's right, it was you. You didn't like the term heterodox and orthodox, but we have to have some term for describing this great mainstream of the economics profession. And I'm always interested in how these mainstream ideas have remained protected from contrary evidence. I do think that that's a really interesting question. And to answer it, we really need the discipline of economics to be studied by specialists in the study of religion. Religion. And just finally, one point to make. It has been said, we have heard today people say that in the progressive agenda, the state has had its day. We need bottom-up solutions, which are sort of outside of the direct control of the state. And somebody mentioned Esther Duflo and Banerjee and their book, Poor Economics. And I'm always struck at the asymmetry. We have a vast, vast literature on poverty and poor economics. We have virtually nothing on rich economics. And I think this reflects the point that social scientists, economists, look at things that they define as problems, and things they don't define as problems don't get studied. So economists don't think of rich people as problems. They think just of poor people as problems. And there's apparently no relationship between the rich people and the poor people. And so that the kind of standard mainstream line in economics about inequality has been the one expressed in the Financial Times 2007 in a debate with me. William Boyter said, poverty bothers me, inequality does not, I just don't care. And so it is true, though, that there has been in the last few years with a lot more work building on the earlier work of Jamie and Milanovic and just a few, and of course, Tony Atkinson, just a sort of handful of people have been working on inequality, but now there's something of a resurgence, but still I'm struck by the fact that rather little of this seems to me to have spilt into the design of public policy. So people are talking about inequality as something of a problem, as they were not on the whole, but it hasn't moved into the domain of serious action to reduce inequality. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sorry, just one other, sorry, I forgot one point. I wrote an 18-page paper about the 3 books, but I decided for this purpose, in order to get us out to lunch early enough, I wouldn't talk to that paper, but the paper is available to, or if you send me an email, I can send it to you. And that's
Send it to us and we'll make it
Okay.
available.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we're going to have question and answer now. And Jamie, would you like to join us up here?
Say
Would you like to join us up here in case people have questions for you as well?
Sure.
So you can stay, Robert. Stay up here if you don't mind. So now we have, we've been given permission to go an extra 10 or 15 minutes in this room.
How far is the lunch restaurant?
10 minutes away. So don't worry, we'll get there. Yes, so questions. Let's take a few of them and then we'll answer them together. Let's start with you, Mohit.
I have a question for Professor Cooper.
I'll say something briefly with it.
After your book came out, it seems your ideas have received a lot of traction and also turned out to be prescient. So there have been 2 IMF working papers in the last year, which have had very heterodox policy conclusions. One is the return of the policy that shall not be named. That's the industrial policy. And I was very surprised to see that it quotes Hajun Chang a lot. I thought that would never happen in my graduate school. And the second paper is probably more recent by Jonathan Ostriefer saying about capital account liberalization. That is again something which is not new to scholars in this room who have read Keynes and know he said that let finance be primary and national. But these things coming from the IMF research department seems at least phenomenal to me. And when I think of the Hirschmanian approach to looking at piecemeal changes, I'm struck by how are these changes too piecemeal, or would you think that are we at the cusp of some kind of productive coherence?
Yes.
Jerry, have you been following the developments with the fights over the central bank and the role of the central bank in India in the last couple of years? And what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Wonderful papers, thank you. There's an interesting tacit tension between Jane's discussion and Ilene as follows. Jane, as always, very eloquently talks about the complete toxicity of financial instruments and their destabilizing effect on the system and the fact that they've gotten away from the regulators. Ilene, at least from the point of view of developing countries, commends a kind of regulatory incoherence as at least better than neoclassical, neoliberal hegemony. Is benign incoherence enough to address the toxicity of financial instruments of which Jane writes?
Okay, we'll take one more short question, and then we'll have some short responses. And then if we have time, we'll take one more round. Yeah.
Just a short one for Jane. Jane, as we have together in the room some of the people who, even going back to the 90s and late 80s, were working together on questions of, financial democracy and so on. And in your agenda, looking at the overall architecture of the international system and the way it's been perverse in many ways, was linked to that. We had a community development movement, and something like the Financial Democracy Center dared to link reform at the International Center with reform of community reinvestment and so on. Do you see is there a movement now in this country that you're linked to that continues this tradition, or should there be?
Okay, so Jamie, we'll start with you.
I don't have a question and a response here, but just a quick comment on, particularly on well, something that relates to Jerry, but also to Jane, which is this question of the meaning of the term independence with respect to a central bank, which is a term which has been abused by the economists. The independent agency was created in the early part of the 20th century in the progressive era to have an institution which was independent of the executive branch. But it was the great campaign of Wright-Patman, which was continued by Henry Royce, to point out and impress on people that independent of the executive branch did not make you independent of the government, because these agencies in the United States framework are creatures of the United States Congress and subject to the authority and the oversight of the Congress. And what we did from 1975 onward was to institute conduct of monetary policy hearings on a regular basis that turned that oversight from something that was nominal into something which was closer to being a real thing. And we also encoded, ultimately, in the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, the mandate, which is diverse, which is called the dual mandate, full employment and reasonable price stability, to give the Federal Reserve an ability to respond flexibly, coming down into the policy set by the U.S. Congress. So you're quite right in saying that in practice, they're.
When was that? When did that happen?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, but
When?
78, Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, 1978. That's the dual mandate as applied to the Federal Reserve particularly. How do I know this? Because the law was drafted in the House under, it was H.R. 50, Hawkins-Royce. It was drafted by a group that included Leon Kaiserling and others in Gus Hawkins' office. And there was one 23-year-old staffer there who got the assignment of the least important part of that bill, which was monetary policy, and the staffer was me. So it was the one thing that was considered totally non-controversial because nobody understood it. And it's the only thing of that bill that actually had a long-term impact. So you're absolutely right in thinking that saying that in practice, the Federal Reserve has been a dependency of the banks. The economists have tried to make it independent of everybody except them. But under the law, which is what matters, it is actually the one reason why we have a better central bank than most other countries is that we took seriously the proposition that there is, in fact, parliamentary and democratic oversight as a matter of law, if not always a matter of practice.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So Ilene, can you start off?
Sure. Thanks for the two questions that were directed to me. Mohit's comments, very interesting. I've been obsessed with the IMF for many years, and I think, like you, probably follow every output that comes from the institution far too closely. And I've also been doing lots of interviews with staff there. And I think you're right to flag that, there are several dimensions along which there's been very significant ideational evolution at the IMF, and much of which has been embodied in policy. The recent work on industrial policy, relegitimizing industrial policy, I think has been really important. Too soon. I mean, that's a paper in the last few months, so hasn't yet been embodied in policy advice to countries. There's also recent work, that is to say in the last couple of weeks, on the effects of financial globalization on inequality, showing that increased levels of financial globalization result in increased inequality. That's a finding that I think has a lot of purchase in this room. What has a longer lineage is the work on capital controls and capital account liberalization, which starting in 2011, IMF economists really started to wrestle with kind of resuscitating a Keynesian view of the role of capital controls as a legitimate tool of policy. And that's been a battle that's been playing out within the fund and the G20 now for several years, and which has actually shown up in policy advice to countries, such that you had the IMF during the global crisis even prescribing capital controls to non-borrowing countries. Colombia is one example. That's an important one. It was a non-borrowing country, and when the IMF team came to do its Article 4 surveillance in Colombia, they said, well, the currency is appreciating so much, you might consider capital controls, to which the neoliberal central bank said, thanks for that advice, but we don't want it. And that was a kind of Alice in Wonderland moment. And there are several other examples along those lines. So we do have this process of ideational change that's uneven, that's messy, that's contested within the fund and within the profession. I think that process is an important one. I think the messiness and the contested nature and the uneven nature of that process is a kind of accurate rendering of the way that most ideas and most policies change. I mean, if we move away from the financial realm and think about something like, LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, these are not epical changes. They happen as a context, in the context of struggle and evolution, one step forward, two steps back. And so I think some of the processes around ideational change within the IMF and within the economics profession kind of have that kind of character. So that's why I kind of hold on to this idea that incoherence creates space for contestation and change. The other part of Mohit's comment, are we on the brink of a kind of new coherence? That is to say, ideas are changing, and are they ossifying in ways that we might like? I tend to think not. I mean, I think that things are still very open-ended and very contested and very uncertain. And so I don't think we're seeing a kind of convergence around a new paradigm. And in some of my work and toward the end of the book, I kind of used the provocative term post-neoliberal era and argue that we're on the brink of a kind of post-neoliberal era, which embodies features of neoliberalism and also features of non-neoliberalism and kleptocratic capitalism, that it's a kind of messy stew of isms. And I think that that's still my reading on where I think we are. In terms of Bob's comment, is productive incoherence sufficient to address the toxicity of certain financial instruments? I'd say it's necessary but not sufficient. And to be less cute about it, I would say that the incoherence that we're seeing in global financial governance and discussions of global financial policy creates space for some policies that can rein in the most toxic forms of finance when there is political will to do so. An example is the way that many developing countries use capital controls that targeted the particular risks of derivatives and locational and maturity mismatch during the global financial crisis, which helped to protect them from some of the most toxic fallout associated with those instruments. So I'm encouraged by that. The alternative is a much kind of thicker form of globalization. I'm thinking Danny Roderick talks about thin globalization, thin rules of the road versus thick rules of the road. I think when we have thick forms of globalization, we get pressure to conformance, we get financial instruments dominating policy, or same's happened with the WTO. This kind of thinner and more contested form of globalization that's emerging right now provides space for policymakers of a certain disposition to develop policies that can be protective of the fallout from financial toxicity. But clearly, there's more to be said about that. Thanks.
Jane?
Two things. What I really believe in is that we are needing the communities. We need these kinds of developments. And I too lived through Humphrey Hawkins. This is the kind of thing, because basically what we need to do is change ideas. We will not get reform without major changes of ideas. And all of these processes that we go through are very important for helping that to occur. I think that we need to get into the community level, and above all, the concern here, the chapter 8 of Jim Crotty's book, to get back to that, to the sense of development, and how do we bring it about, and what ways will it occur. On the other hand, I must say that to continue to live with a system globally that is pro-cyclical is insanity. And it has to be stopped, like Trump has to be stopped. This kind of a system is going to cause, it's already causing instability around the clock, etc. And we have at risk the household sector, which now is the shock absorber for all of this instability that occurs in the market, and the sense that what we're looking at macroeconomically as well is the net worth of the household sector as a major factor in demand, etc. And so this system has eroded the potential for countercyclical policy in the global economy, and The next crisis is therefore going to be extremely difficult to manage.
So you ask about the central bank in India. I haven't been following that closely, so I think rather than venture some speculation about it, I just we could talk about this later. But thank you. Yes, of course. Maybe
Yes.
move over here.
I'll just stand up.
Yeah.
I just wanted to put on the table the point that the neoliberal movement is very well organized in a way that, let's say, the social democratic movement is not. I mean, and well organized on a global scale. I'm talking, for example, but this is only one example, of the Mont Pelerin Society and the Atlas Network. The Atlas Network is headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. It has, it's the engine room, or one of the engine rooms of the neoliberal movement. It is very actively engaged in raising finance from the Koch brothers and from all kinds of other billionaires. It has what it calls partner relationships with 450 think tanks and campaign organizations all around the world. And it is devoted to pushing out these neoliberal ideas, quite contrary to the kind of ideas that have come up from the panel now. So I always get the impression that the Social Democrats are sort of going into the boxing ring with these people with one hand tied behind their back. They are much better organized, much better financed than the entities which are promoting the kind of ideas that we've been talking about before. So we should recognize that is the nature of the fight. Remember that in the 1930s and in the 1940s and after, people like Hayek and Friedman and so on said, we have lost the battle. We have lost the battle. Keynes has won. Now we have to step back. We have to regroup. We have to capture slowly institutional power. And we have to persuade public opinion that our neoliberal ideas, and they were proud to call them neoliberal ideas, it was not a term of criticism. They were boastful that they were neoliberals. Our neoliberal ideas have to begin to change public opinion, and then we will be able to take control of global economic policy. And they've done it.
Well, thank you. Well, we have our work cut out for us, and these books here and these discussions are exactly what we need to move forward to defeat neoliberalism in its various forms. I'm now going to turn the table over to the floor for James Galbraith. Thank you very much.
Well, this has been, I think we can all agree, a very remarkable morning symposium on macroeconomic policy in the shadow of the great financial crisis. To close it, I just want to say, I think I learned two things that are relevant in my early days as a member of the staff of the U.S. Congress, and particularly on the Banking Committee in the House and the Joint Economic Committee. One is that the emergence of a current of thought into practical influence is an uncertain process. It's historically contingent. It can be helped by access to money and control of institutions, but it's not entirely reliant on that. What is much more important is to keep a working group going together, operating on the problems, developing ideas in a way over a long period of time, in a way which can surface from time to time to let the world know that it's there and that it does in fact exist, and it does in fact have the quality that was displayed this morning by all the panelists. So I just want to say that's the first real message here, is that there is a ongoing, developing, and growing body of thought that is addressed to the actual problems that we have to deal with. And the second thing is, it's a institutional and practical matter is that the power to convene is a very great power. The power to call a hearing, to launch a study, to say something to the wider world from a stage. That's a very great power. And for that reason, I have to express enormous gratitude to the two institutions that have given to me and to our friends here the power to convene this meeting. And they are, of course, the Political Economy Research Institute, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and the LBJ Washington Center, a branch of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And I particularly want to thank the people who did the legwork to bring this event together. Nicole Dunham, the administrative manager of the PERI, Kim Weinstein, the communications director of PERI, and with the LBJ School, Robin Boone, the deputy director of the Washington Center, and Bill Shute, the director of the Washington Center, that's stepped into that role at a time when we really needed him. And I have one final word of thanks. It's been a great morning, and of course we've had the authors of 3 important books who are here, but I think we owe a special word of thanks to Jim Crotty, who couldn't be here, but who gave us a reason to hold this meeting with the publication of his book, Keynes Against Capitalism, his liberal case, his economic case for liberal socialism. A remarkable piece of work, and the fact that it's remarkable is attested to by the fact that everybody who was asked to come and speak at the symposium was delighted to do so, pleased to do so. And so I want to say to Jim, congratulations on this book, and thank you for writing it. Thank you from all of us here. And thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for your time.